Okay, good evening. Welcome to the RSU 5 board meeting. It's Wednesday, December 13th. We are back at the Freeport High School Library after a few meetings on the road. We have a couple of folks that are making their way in. It was tough parking tonight, so we'll just get started with the expectation that I know Valley will be back, and we expect Jeremy will also be here this evening. I'd like to welcome Ben Meringue, who this is his first meeting here as the student rep. We have two student reps on the board, and they alternate meetings, and this is Ben's first, so welcome. And we'll get started with the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, consideration and approval of the minutes. We'll take a motion for consideration and approval of the minutes from the November 29th, 2017 meeting. Please note that the ones that went out in the original packet were revised. She emailed the revised ones, but she also included it in your packets here. I believe it was mostly around who was here for the meeting. So the revised meeting minutes are in your packet. So we take a motion on those. John, second from Valley. All those in favor? None opposed? Thank you. Adjustments to the agenda. I think the only adjustment we have is we're going to move item 10A, which is Bill Stockmeyer's presentation to the board regarding the cost-sharing formula. We're going to move that up in the agenda after 7, after our first public comment period, so that so we can get him moving. That was the only adjustment, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so we're going to start with good news and recognition. If you couldn't tell from Maddie's shirt, we're going to recognize the boys and girls cross-country team.
Yes, we really want to congratulate our boys cross-country team. They came in first in the Western Maine Conference Championship. They competed against 17 other schools in the conference, and through their perseverance and hard work came out on top. And we also want to recognize Lily Horn from the girls cross-country team. She placed first at the Western Maine Conference Championship, and then at regionals she placed second, and then when she went to the state she beat the person who beat her in the regionals and came out on top. And so we're really happy to recognize both Lily and the boys cross-country team tonight.
All right, so we have little certificates for you guys. So.
Martin's got this. Martin, double duty.
All right. You want to take it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. There we go. Let's see, who we got? Keith Cockburn.
Coburn, not here.
All right. Promise Doyle.
Yeah.
Martin Horn.
Western Maine Conference, and it's only the second time ever we won Western Maine Conference. But this year, a lot of teams didn't run their best runners at the conference meet. And the boys recognize that. However, we were second at regionals and second overall in the state in Class B. So that was quite the accomplishment for the boys. And Lily was the second fastest runner in the entire state. So.
Okay, 6C, report from the board's student rep.
First of all, congratulations to the cross-country team. That's amazing. Second of all, quick introduction. My name is Benjamin Meringue. I'm a junior at Freeport High School. And if any of you noticed the last name, he is my dad. Yes.
That's why we separated.
Right, exactly. Shenanigans. So let's jump right into it. I've actually been away from the school for a little while due to an injury, so I don't have a whole lot to say on this. However, a couple quick things on some student activities. The fall basketball season and other sports season have started, but the boys and girls have both had their season openers thus far. The boys won their opener 78-34, and the girls won their opener 41-40. So that's great. They're both 1-0 with their wins. Also, the Freeport Performing Arts recently just held their auditions for one acts. Jeff and Maya both got the leads for those, and that will be starting rehearsals fairly soon, and we'll be performing that later on this winter. Finally, there's a concert Tuesday the 19th next week for band, chorus, and jazz band. We've been preparing for that for a while, so you should come out. And we're all happy that winter break is just about to start. That's about it. That's all I got for you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so public comment. So we have 2 public comment periods on our agenda. So this is the first. If we had anyone who wanted to share. Can't tell if people are mass exodus or want to come to public comments.
Thanks for the chance. I'm Alan Tracy, the guy who sent the kind of cranky letter today about proficiency-based grading. But that's why I wanted to come. I did want to follow up on that. My wife and I both are very concerned, and I think a lot of people are concerned, quite honestly, about where we're headed with our evaluation system, and in particular the 1 through 4 evaluation model. Obviously, we've been at it for many years now. I have 3 kids in the RSU. I have 2 in middle school. I have 1 at the Mass Landing School. And I've been to a lot of teacher meetings, seen a lot of power school grades. And I just think there's a general concern that we're missing the mark on student evaluation. And I'm really just here to ask specifically that you guys spend some time and make some room for it on the agenda, on your agenda, whatever that may be. I can't imagine that there's really anything more important at this point than our student evaluation, particularly with what's going on in 9th grade and how it's being applied now. We have our family has a pretty good history with it, and if you saw my letter, I kind of identified some of the things that frustrate us as a family with it, but I think there's some bigger issues. I think there's questions about what are our neighboring communities doing on this. My understanding, my own informal kind of survey, is that many of them have not adopted the 1 through 4 method. And I'm not here to ask to get rid of the 1 through 4 method, but I think there's a lot of tweaking that needs to be done, and I think a lot of time needs to be spent. Obviously, this is a really important issue as kids get ready to make applications to college. And I think even more fundamentally, quite honestly, kids want to know how they're doing. And I think there's a problem with that right now. I think I can tell you from my own students who are really hard workers, who end up with a 3. I know a lot of you guys have kids in the school. There's something wrong. There's really something missing in this system. And so really I'm just here, I sent a letter, hopefully you could see that, but really just to ask. And I think there's a lot of, there's going to be some movement for this in the community. I think people have a lot of questions, and I think there's a lot of concern. So that's my request, that's my comment. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Any others? Okay. So we are going to move on to 10A, new business, the RSU 5 cost sharing formula with Mr. Stockmeyer.
Good evening. I'm Bill Stockmeyer from Drummond Woodsum, and I was asked to assist the board by preparing a memorandum that would basically give you some background as to your existing cost-sharing formula, which you've had in effect, as I understand it, for more than 5 years now, as well as what the process is for amending the formula, as well as my own thoughts on what constitutes a fair formula. It's a little bit like beauty being in the eye of the beholder, of course, but I do have some comments on that. And then I've also provided some seemingly complicated tables, but I will simplify them for you, that demonstrate some possible alternatives to the existing formula you have. Obviously, there are an infinite number of other possible formulas you might adopt, but there's some practical realities that would prevent that. So what I've tried to do is maybe give you the examples and focus on a few of those. I did just note a couple of the tables I see some errors in, but fortunately they're sort of off the critical path of our discussion. I'll provide an update once I figure out where I went wrong on those two tables, which represent sort of outliers. But so I'll provide a corrective page hopefully tomorrow. So Ginny had prepared handouts for you, which consist of a 9-page memorandum, and then some additional handouts. One is an adopted budget impact sheet, which shows the current budget and how the local shares are derived. I also included a section of your existing reorganization plan that describes your current cost-sharing formula, which I will summarize and try to explain tonight, but you're welcome to read that if you're having trouble sleeping tonight. A copy of the ED 279, which is simply the State Department of Education printout that determines the costs of the district that are considered necessary for the essential programs and services model, and which also determines the level of state subsidy you receive. And finally, there's some relevant pages of the original Reorganization Planning Committee facts, FAQs, that are relevant to how you got to your original cost-sharing formula. So let's take this one step at a time. And sometimes when you have a long memo or something to look at, why don't we just look at each part so we can sort of see where we're going to go in this. And so if you have the memo in front of you on page 1, first I'm going to discuss the components of your formula. Then beginning on page 4, I discuss the process that you need to use should you decide to amend the formula. That's part 2 of the memo, page 4 of 9. The page numbers are at the top. Then part 3, my thoughts or some thoughts on what constitutes fairness in cost-sharing formulas. Obviously, some of that is somewhat objective, but the way I usually approach that is by saying, well, what do other school districts in Maine do? All right, so if no one's doing it, maybe it's fair, maybe it's not, but that ought to tell you something, right? If lots of people are doing it, maybe it's fair, maybe it's not, but that might also inform your decision. And then part 4, the title of which is somewhat lengthy and will only make sense after I take you through parts 1 to 3, but basically a comparison of your cost-sharing formula to some other alternatives. So going back to part 1, the components. So basically, your cost-sharing formula, the cost that you pay with local taxes and which has to be allocated among your towns, applies to the portion of the total operating budget, including adult education, that can't be paid from other sources, right? So the first thing that has to be done if you have your total operating budget to determine how much needs to be divided up among the towns is to back out the other revenue sources, okay? So the other revenue sources include, as your formula defines it, state-supported debt first. That's the debt service that qualifies for state subsidy under the EPS funding model. In your case, currently, that consists of debt on the Durham Elementary School that qualifies for state subsidy. Then you back out other state subsidy. Now, your model treats those two things separately, but if you think about it, you're just backing out all all the state subsidy between those two steps, right? And you can look at the at the ED 279 if you wish to at some point and see how that dollar amount is determined. And then you back out other miscellaneous revenues, okay? And those might include non-tax revenues from various sources. Maybe you receive some amount of tuition revenues from other students. You get other funding sources. And it may include some or all of your unallocated, undesignated fund balance that you use to reduce the tax burden. So those miscellaneous revenues get backed out. It's the remaining costs that are funded by the cost-sharing formula. And under Section 13B of your reorganization plan, which I did provide, but I would suggest you not turn to it right now, under 13B of the plan, your cost-sharing formula has 3 different components. Each of them requires some local property taxes to be raised by the members. The first component is called, in your case, pre-existing non-shared debt. When the RSU was formed and came together, it was decided that there were certain facilities that were not shared by all the students or shared by support staff or administrators. And it was determined that the individual towns that had that type of debt would continue to pay that non-state supported debt on its own, okay? And in your case, there currently remains about $200,000 in Durham debt and about $170,000 in Freeport debt. Either Pownell didn't have when it joined or has since paid off any local debt for non-shared facilities if it had any. The formula requires those 2 towns to continue to contribute to pay that debt as it comes due without contribution from the other RSU 5 members. About 1/3 of the Durham debt will be retired in about a year, and as I understand it, about 2/3 of the Durham debt will be retired in 2030, and the Freeport debt, that would be $170,000, is the current balance, would be retired in 2021. Okay, and I'm going to throw you a curveball, Michelle, but the $200,000, $170,000, those are the principal balances of that debt, not the annual.
That's actually the annual.
That's the annual. Okay, that's right. That is what I used. Okay, good. So I'm sorry. So that's not the amount of debt. That's the annual payment amount currently. Okay. And typically that declines a little bit each year until it's paid off as the principal balance declines. Unlike your home mortgage debt, which is equal payments, municipal debt is typically equal principal payments with a declining interest amount, so the payments sort of gradually decline until the last payment and they end. So there are a couple things to notice, worth noticing, I guess, about this pre-existing debt component. The first is that as Freeport and Durham respectively retire their non-shared debt, that will reduce that town's share of local costs without increasing the share of the other members, right? Because once that Freeport retires its debt, its share will go down, but the debt's simply retired. That will not increase Pownell and Durham's share, okay? So it's worth noting that, because with respect to other local taxes, when one town pays less, the other towns pay more, but that is not true of this component. Second, for purposes of this memo, I've just arbitrarily assumed that any cost-sharing amendment that you might wish to consider would not change that component of your cost-sharing formula. That was originally conceived as part of the plan. You're in the middle of doing that. I'm not saying you couldn't do it, although I'd want to research that. I think it was an assumption going into the plan, but I've just assumed whatever change you did wouldn't affect those payments of non-shared debt, okay? And the third thing to think about with regard to this pre-existing debt component is that as that debt is retired by Freeport or by Durham, should you adopt a cost-sharing amendment that increases the share of one or both of those two towns, if that should happen, the payoff of that non-shared debt offsets that increase to some extent, right? Everyone got that? So if you have a formula that results in town A paying more and town B paying less, but then town A's debt is retired, that sort of offsets the increase. Okay, just worth noticing that moving part. Now, how the state derives the amount of state subsidy, let me just mention, is fairly complicated. About as good a summary as you'll find of it is in footnote 2. It's in a footnote for a reason. Feel free not to read it, but if you're really obsessed with how the state funding formula works, that is a succinct summary of that. So, but again, there's a reason it's in a footnote. So the first component of your cost-sharing formula is this non-shared debt. The second component of your cost-sharing formula, and let me just say here, yours is different from everyone else in the state, so when you're talking to anyone else in any other school district, trust me, your terminology is different, how it works is different, it's unique in the state, okay? So don't necessarily learn from another school board member in another district as to what that means in your case, because it won't apply in your case. Yours is particular to your school district, and that's neither good or bad, that's just how it is. The second component, I'm sorry? No. There are a few unique ones, and some are the same or variants on a theme, okay? The second component of yours is called the total required local contribution component. And the reorganization, the cost-sharing formula says that each member will pay an amount equal to its most recent total state adjusted valuation times the mill rate that the state establishes on that ED 279, which is 8.19 mills, okay? 1 mill is $1 of tax for every $1,000 of property valuation. Okay, an easier way to understand it is 1 mill is $100 of tax, get this right, is $100 tax for every $100,000 house. Okay, that's what a mill equates to. There is a statewide mill rate established by the Department of Education for purposes of state subsidy. That is the same across the state. And the first part, those remaining costs that weren't funded by the other revenue sources, and after also the towns paying their non-shared state debt, each town then contributes its property valuation times that mill rate, okay? Now the plan notes that this total required local contribution of a member may exceed what's called its local cost share expectation to be paid under the EPS model. This is one of the aspects of your plan that's unique. And the plan also notes that, the formula notes that any amount paid as the total required local contribution that exceeds the amount the town would pay under the EPS funding model goes to reduce the additional local money component, which I'm going to get to next. So it's off the top of the third component. So I guess the thing to keep in mind here is that currently under the ED 279 formula, Freeport qualifies for a special education minimum receiver adjustment under the EPS funding model, and in the way your formula works, however, is Freeport contributes that back as a sum to be shared with the other two towns. That's probably the best way of understanding that, so that all three benefit from that component instead of just Freeport. The third component of your local cost sharing is called additional local money, not to be confused with what is commonly called additional local funds. For most districts, after they pay their EPS shares, the remainder is called additional local funds. Your additional local money component is slightly different because of that credit due to the surplus payment under the total required local contribution component. So that remaining portion of local cost is shared under your cost sharing formula according to fixed percentages established when the school district was formed. Those percentages are Durham 21.42%, Freeport 65.9%, and Pownell 12.6% of the additional local money. Under your formula, those percentages are fixed. For almost everyone else in the state, Their shares of additional local funds, which is different from additional local monies, vary as their property valuations vary relative to each other, and in some cases their student count percentages vary. Yours are fixed. Your percentages were derived under that FAQ handout accompanying the materials. Those were derived as follows. In the base year, which was the year prior to the formation of your district, each town was paying a certain amount of additional local funds. And so those percentages were derived from what the towns were paying in the year before they went in. If you think about it, that sort of eases you into a district because you pay a percentage equal to the additional local funds you were paying before. On the other hand, it never varies over time, and arguably the further you get from the start of the district, the less likely it is that those percentages make sense, I guess would be the way to put it. And again, your additional local money component differs from other districts' additional local funds in that there is an offset first for the represented by the surplus paid by Freeport or contributed by Freeport in excess of what Freeport would have paid if you strictly followed the EPS funding model cost share distributions. So I think I'll stop there, and you can read more, and you may want to read more. But we're going to get to sort of the practical impact of that in a minute. The next thing I wanted to talk about is that, I suppose I could say that at the end of the day, in total, the way your formula works is actually very close to valuation percentages. Okay, at the end of the day, it's actually pretty darn close to if you just divided up all of those costs on the basis of the town's respective valuation percentages, right? Each town's property valuation added up. Numerator is your town's valuation, denominator is the total valuation of the district. The percentages that you pay and contribute as towns end up being very close to those valuation percentages as it happens. I'd like any questions at this point. That's part one. Okay. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the process for amending it, the formula, because if you think about it, the process for amending the formula might affect what amendments have a reasonable chance of being enacted, right? If the rules are such that the amendment doesn't have a reasonable chance of being enacted, fair or not, one might debate whether it's worth much time discussing it, right? So there are two ways that you can amend your cost sharing formula. The first one is a board vote. I'll call it a board vote with bells and whistles, okay? The board can implement a change with a majority vote that satisfies what I would call a quorum requirement and what I would call a vote distribution requirement. Now, those terms aren't in the cost sharing formula plan, but that's how I understand them. The quorum requirement says that in addition to a majority vote of the board, at least one board member from each town must be present at the meeting. So what does that mean? If town A really doesn't like the change, how many board members from that town are going to come to the meeting? None, right? And the quorum requirement won't be satisfied. Everyone got it? So it's like a majority vote with a little extra fairness, okay, or buy-in, if you will. At least, even if they vote no, they have to at least be there, okay? Then there's also a vote distribution requirement. What the plan says is that board members representing 2/3 or more of the RSU population must vote in favor of the change. So assuming Freeport doesn't have 2/3 of the population, is that true? Does not have 2/3 of the population? At least one board member from one other town would have to join, and the population of those two towns together would have to equal 2/3 of the population. So maybe two towns wouldn't be enough in some cases. Well, Durham and Pownell wouldn't be 2/3 of the population.
Are you talking student population or town population?
Town population.
Okay.
Okay, so there's got to be more buy-in, if you will. So if you think about it, in order for the board to implement a change, the board has to generally feel the change is fair, right? Or at least practical, if not fair, okay? The second way, and if that happens, you don't need a referendum vote. The board can implement that change. You represent the voters, you were elected, it's got broad-based support. Pretty good idea. If it's got that broad-based support, the referendum is really probably not necessary, okay? So I guess that's conceptually, I'm just speaking my thoughts on what may have been in the minds of the people that developed this idea. It's not really necessary to have the referendum vote because it's got a broad enough support from you representatives here who are already elected. The other methodology, if you can't get that broad-based support, you can only get a majority vote, is it goes to referendum. Okay? Now, if you don't have that broad-based support, what's the likelihood it's going to pass a referendum? Well, it actually could, right? Because the referendum doesn't have these special bells and whistles. It's just a vote of the voters at a referendum vote. Okay? So those are the two methods. So you want to be thinking about that. All right. Any questions about that? Yes. The two methods are prescribed in the reorganization plan. Those are the two methods. Yep. Okay. Any other questions on that? All right. I suppose it's worth mentioning, because you're smart people, it's probably occurred to you that if you have a method that one town with the majority of votes on the board prefers, it would be possible to get it to a referendum, and it might even be possible to get it passed. Districts, first of all, I would say that generally in my observation is that school members try really hard to represent the students and the population as a whole. I think they feel that that's their charge, and I think that's correct, although you're elected by a town. Also, remember, there is a process for, as I'm sure you're aware, withdrawing from a school district, and if you have an unfair cost-sharing formula, I can tell you that you will have to go through that, which is not an easy process. So that perhaps keeps the playing field level to a certain extent. Yes?
For option number 2, is that just a simple majority?
Yes. Simple majority of the board and simple majority of the RSU voters. So not a majority in each town or a majority of the overall vote. So what's fair? So people are going to disagree on that. So let me just make a few observations. My observations are based on my general background experience across the state for quite a number of years now. And in part, we actually looked through our client files and tried to do a survey of the different methods that exist and what's out there. So we have at least a partial survey. I wouldn't say that's complete, but it's probably representative. So the first thing I'd say is most school districts apply their cost-sharing formulas only to the additional local funds portion of the budget. Okay, they accept the allocations derived on that state printout as town shares for that portion of their costs, and then they have a formula that applies only to the additional local funds portion of their budget. Okay, as I've explained, yours is a little different because it has that total required local contribution section, which takes that minimum receiver adjustment for Freeport and shares it with everybody. So in that sense, your formula applies to that part of the budget also. Okay. Second, a majority of other cost-sharing formulas are based in whole upon adjusted state valuation percentages. In other words, when the cost-sharing formulas are applied to the additional local funds portion of the budget, in most cases, valuation is used. In a majority of cases, more than half, just use valuation. The other component being pupil count. Okay, you can have any factor you want. You can be the number of redheaded delivery people in town could be the basis. But in general, it's pupil count and valuation. And in one district, they use population as perhaps a more reasonable example of a factor, or used to use population. So the great majority only apply the formula to the additional local funds portion. A majority of the formulas are based in whole upon valuation percentages. There is a significant minority of other cost-sharing formulas that use a combination of valuation and pupil count. In those cases, 50% or more is allocated by valuation, and under 50% is allocated by pupil count. In other words, even in school districts that use both factors, more weight is given to valuation than is given to pupil count. Okay? To our knowledge, I'm not aware of any districts that use pupil count percentages only. Okay? Fifth, as I mentioned, it's unusual, highly unusual, to use a factor other than valuation or pupil count. I wouldn't say you necessarily fall in that category. You have sort of you have your own way of doing it, but as I mentioned, yours comes out pretty close to valuation. And finally, I just want to mention here, and I'll mention later, if you decide to change your cost-sharing formula, obviously, one or more town shares will go up and one or more town shares will go down, right? It is possible to change the formula and to phase that in over a period of years. Sometimes you see 3 years, sometimes you don't see a phase in, sometimes you see 3 years, sometimes you see 5 years. It might even be possible to phase it in irregularly to account for the retirement of those debt service portions that I mentioned, to minimize the cost impact in any particular year. So what are the arguments in favor of using property valuation, since that seems to be the more popular, widely popular method? So the principle is that property taxes should be assessed in proportion to property valuation across a taxing district. In fact, property taxation is, as a general rule, required by the Maine Constitution. It's a constitutional principle subject to certain express exceptions. And those are things like that you've heard of, like tree growth taxes. It's actually an exception to the requirement that property be taxed in accordance with valuation. Somebody gets a break, even though for tree growth. Farm and open space property. And another one is that under the Constitution, school districts can assess their taxes according to any method that they desire. But the general rule, the general understanding is that taxes are going to be proportional across a taxing district. So what's your taxing district? Well, you don't have a municipal school system like Portland. You have a school district. Your taxing district is all 3 towns. And conceptually, what that means is that these aren't really the town's students, these are the district students, okay? If you have a school district system, the services provided on a district-wide basis, the argument would be, and I think it has some force, that the taxes ought to apply on a district-wide basis. Under this view, what's the role of the towns? Well, the towns really are just the tax collection system for the district, right? Once your taxes are decided by your voters, you figure out the shares, you send an assessment to the towns, and the towns collect and pay over the taxes, right? That's simply so that you don't have to have a separate tax collection system, right? If you didn't use the town, you'd have to hire your own assessors and your own tax collection people, and that wouldn't make any sense. So they're not really town taxes. The towns are just the agents for collecting the school district taxes, viewed that way. And then I suppose what this means is that this proportionate taxation concept means that if you have a restaurant in one town, it's being taxed on the same basis as a restaurant in another town. Okay, why should the number of students in the town matter? So that would be the argument. The service is provided on a district basis. The taxes should be assessed on a district basis. So that's the concept. The argument for using pupil count is a much more practical one. In some areas of the state, we have high valuation and low pupil count towns that would not be could not be encouraged to join school districts with low valuation, high pupil count towns. Okay, so by introducing a pupil count factor to these towns that are high in property valuation and low in student count, you sort of encourage them economically to form school districts. Under this view, each town's obligation to support the school depends upon its number of pupils, okay? As if it had a separate school system and a separate system of taxation for its schools, which it actually doesn't once it joins a school district. But again, the practical reality is, in some cases, it is necessary to move from what some might regard as the ideal valuation to something that is more practical and encourages towns with different percentages to join. So under this system, a restaurant in one town may be taxed differently than a restaurant with the same valuation in another town, even though both restaurants support the same school system. So, as I mentioned, I think that discussion fairly reflects what we actually see out in the field, if you think about it. A majority of school districts use valuation. A substantial minority use valuation and student count. Of those, the majority factor is still valuation. All right, so that sort of suggests that, in general, people feel that valuation is the fairest method, but there's recognition to some local realities that to get towns to join, you may have to give some weight to pupil count. Okay, now, part 4 has a terribly long title to it, but let's walk our way through it. What would be the economic impact of changing the method of sharing costs, changing the RSU 5 method of sharing costs to A, part A, here's one idea, a method based on valuation and or pupil count factors, okay? Or B, and by that I mean use the EPS shares and apply your formula, either valuation or pupil count or some combination, to the additional local funds. Sort of get rid of this required total local contribution, allow Freeport its minimum special ed receiver adjustment. Or B, continue to use the total required local contribution and then adopt valuation and or pupil count factors for the additional local monies, okay? A would be using it just for the additional local funds. You buy into the ED 279 and you apply your formula to just the rest. B, you keep your valuation times statewide mill rate factor, which leads to a little pool of money that is then shared and reduced from the additional local funds, leaving additional local monies that would be shared using valuation and or pupil count. So that's what we're going to discuss here. And we're going to get to some tables, but I'll walk you really slowly through the tables. Okay. The first thing I want you to look at is Table 1. And that compares valuation, pupil count, and additional local money percentages for FY 17 and 18. Now, to simplify this, there's not much difference between 17 and 18. Okay, we're in 18, fiscal year 18, right? 2017-18, July 1 to June 30, 2018. So let's just look at 2018, since they're not very different. That's the right-hand side. Okay, so Durham, you can see, has 18% valuation and almost 32% pupil count. Freeport has 71% valuation and 58% pupil count, and Pownell is about the same, 10.75 valuation and 10.32% pupil count. Okay, and then remember I said that those additional local monies are divided up based upon those fixed percentages established in the base year, the year before the district was formed, based upon what the dollar amounts they were contributing at the time. I put those there just so you could see that. So ALM is that additional local monies. Those fixed percentages are 21.42% for Durham, 65.98 for Freeport, 12.6 for Pownell. Those percentages are in your reorganization plan. That's how they're fixed. They don't change from year to year. So Table 1 shows, in the first set of bullets there, Durham has a low valuation, 18% relative to its pupil count, right? 32%. A formula weighted towards valuation reduces Durham's relative costs, okay? because it has low valuation, right? While a formula weighted towards pupil counts would increase Durham's costs. Freeport has high valuation relative to its pupil count, although I would say here the difference isn't quite as extreme as in Durham. It runs the opposite way, but in not quite as extreme a fashion, right? A formula weighted towards valuation is going to increase Freeport's relative costs, while a formula weighted towards pupil count decreases them. And I already mentioned that pretty much what you have ends up being very close to valuation, and we'll see that anyway. The problem, of course, is if Freeport decides to reduce its costs by moving more towards pupil count, that's going to increase the other two towns, who are not going to be particularly happy, presumably, unless Freeport can justify why that change ought to be made. Pownell's valuation is about the same relative to pupil count. So what that means is Pownell may not care too much which method is used, right? It's not going to move the needle very much at all, because whether valuation is used, if 100% valuation is used, Pownell is at 10.75%. If 100% pupil count is used, Pownell is at 10.32%. If any combination of valuation and pupil count is used, Pownell will be somewhere between those two numbers, right? So Pownell may not be as great, will not be as greatly affected by this. So this table also shows, and I think this is worth noting, the Durham's current fixed ALM percentage, that's on the right-hand column, 21.42%, is less than its pupil percentage and more than its valuation percentage. It falls between those two numbers. Everyone see that? Likewise, Freeport's ALM of 65.98%, that's the fixed amount Freeport's paying, falls between the two numbers. I would say that Durham's is closer to, fairly close to valuation, Freeport rather than pupil count, and Freeport's is about more like midway between valuation and pupil count. And Pownell's, the other thing to note is that Pownell's 12.6% is more than either its valuation or its pupil count. And that's probably worth noting. If you think of those as sort of the range. Now, I will say this. These percentages are just the ALM percentage. If you have a pen handy, you might want to write down in the right-hand column that if I take all the costs, including that total required local contribution, and figure out those percentages, Durham is at 19.7%. Freeport is at, if I can read my own writing, 69%, and Pownell is at 11.2%. Still higher than either its valuation or pupil count, but not as bad as 12.6%. Okay? So those three numbers, 19.7 for Durham, 69 for Freeport, and 11.2 for Pownell, would be not just at the fixed ALM component, but looking at the actual costs paid by each town this year as a percentage of the total. Okay? Okay, so now I'm going to get to the complicated tables. And there are 2 pages of complicated tables. Those are Table 2 and Table 3. So we're just going to simplify this first by just looking at Table 2. We're not even going to look at Table 3. All right, now I'm going to simplify this somewhat because I think I mentioned I saw a math mistake that's a little off our beaten path. You still want to see the numbers, but just draw an X over the last 2 parts of this page, labeled 2575 valuation of pupil count model and 100% pupil count model. There's something wrong with my numbers. I think those options are off the beaten path, so I'll fix them, but don't get worried about it. I think the other ones are correct, thankfully. Okay, so what do we have here? That leaves us 4 little tables on this in Table 2, right? And that's a lot of numbers. So how do we simplify this for you? So let's just look at the top one. That says current cost sharing formula. And you see the 3 towns on the left. Well, remember I said your components are 3 in number. You have local non-shared debt. Remember I said that? And I mentioned that Freeport and Durham each have local non-shared debt. And that's the annual payment amount, and Pownell has 0 in that column. The second component is that required local contribution, okay, which again is valuation times that statewide mill rate, Okay, same. Think of a mill rate as a level of tax effort. Okay, that's how I like to think of it. If you think of, 8.16 mills is $8.16 per $1,000 valuation. That's less effort than 9 mills, which is less effort than 10 mills. So a uniform effort. Okay, your formula requires a uniform effort based on valuation for the required local contribution. Okay, and then the third component are these additional local monies, which are those fixed percentages. Okay, on the ALM on the preceding page. So then if you add those all up, you get what each town is paying this year. And then I added one last column, and that would be, well, what if this were the year that all the debt were retired? Okay, just for kicks. Let's think about that also, okay? So that reduces the number for Durham, it reduces the number for Freeport, and Pownell stays the same because it doesn't have any non-shared local debt. Everyone understand that table now? Okay, so you got a total by municipality, 3 components to the left of it, and then on the right, well, what if this were the year the debt were all paid? And it's not, but that's a little bit of a moving variable there. All right. Now, so what if we go to, and the second table says 100% valuation model applied to additional local funds, widely used in Maine. Okay? So by that I mean, remember I said in most districts the cost sharing formula only applies to the additional local funds. Let's say we accepted the EPS numbers. Okay, we still had the local non-shared debt. Remember I said we would just assume that wouldn't change. Then we have the EPS numbers from the ED 279 for EPS shares. And you can see that Freeport's share would be lower, okay, if that were the case. Now, the other towns don't necessarily correspond, and those numbers are correct. You're just going to have to take it on faith for now. Okay, the additional local funds are then the remaining contribution that has to be made, and if those were based upon valuation, using the current valuation percentages, that's how those numbers would come out. And so then you can see what the totals would be, and again, what if we didn't have debt? So let's just look at the first two. Durham, currently $4,957,000 and change. Durham's share with a 100% valuation model would be $4,737,000. Freeport, $17,355,000. If you move to a 100% valuation model, $17,692,000 and change. And Pownell would go down. Okay. The next two charts, I don't think we really need to look at them, but they ask, well, what if we did the same thing, applied the formula only to the additional local funds, but we used 75% valuation, 25% pupil count, and then 50% valuation, 50% pupil count. Okay, so you see Durham's goes up somewhat or down somewhat, excuse me, if you use 100% valuation. Then it keeps going up the more valuation is used. Okay, because it keeps going up as you add pupil count component, right? Because Durham has more pupils than valuation in terms of percentage. Freeport, on the other hand, if you had 100% valuation, would be at 17,692, and its share would go down as pupil count got added into the mix. Okay? So, and Pownell's pretty much stays the same throughout because its percentages are the same. Now, the other way to amend the formula, and again, it's not the other way to amend the formula, there are an infinite number of things you might do, are shown on Table 3. And remember that for this table I said, well, let's keep your total local contribution. Let's keep that offset with a minimum special adjustment, and then apply these factors to, instead of the additional local funds, to what your plan calls the additional local monies. So keep the first half of your plan, but let's get away from the fixed percentages and go to one based on valuation or based partially on valuation and student count. So the first chart here is just, again, what you do now. It really is the same as the first chart on the preceding page. Okay, that's your current scenario. You see the 3 components, you see the total by municipality, and what if you didn't have debt. So the next one says, well, what would happen if we used valuation, okay? And you can see how the numbers change if you use valuation applied now to additional local monies instead of additional local funds and using the plan required local contribution. And then we have options showing increasing the pupil count weight and decreasing the valuation weight. Now, I don't want you to look at all that. I mean, you can if you want to. So the next page is, what I've done is
May I
I've...
ask one question?
Yes.
Before we move on. For the table 2, where you have the second, third, and fourth tables, are those assuming that Freeport will still leave the minimum receivership subsidy for the whole RSU? The second, third, and fourth?
No,
No.
Because these use the ED 279, which
Okay.
credits Freeport with that amount.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And I'm not arguing that the EBS model is fair, and I won't say I'm neutral on that. There was a lot of criticism that might be leveled at the model, but we're just looking at what if the model were followed, and then what if you kept the first half of your formula in Table 3.
So the ED 279 is, even though we're a district, is done by town, correct? There's
So
an ED 279 for each town.
I can refer you to footnote 2, that long footnote.
Yeah.
Basically, the way the model works is, first the model determines the amount that the state deems necessary to run your schools, which is way less than the amount that's actually necessary to run your schools, okay? Then it requires each town. The next step in the model is to allocate a portion of that total to each town based upon the town's student count. Basically as if, well, what if they were separate? We've determined that X dollars is necessary for this district. Durham has 10% of the students. About 10% of those costs are attributable to Durham. Now let's see if Durham can afford its share by multiplying its valuation times our statewide mill rate expectation. If Durham can't afford its share, as determined by its percentage of students, state subsidy kicks in. Durham pays less. That does not mean the other towns pay more. It means the state is a partner. They pay in state matching funds. They don't pay it to Durham, they pay it to the district. And then the same is true for the other 2 towns. In some districts, a town can afford to pay their share as determined by student count with less than the state mill rate expectation, okay? In your particular case, Freeport is close enough to that boundary that it qualifies for a minimum receiver adjustment of $200,000 or $300,000, as I recall. So Freeport gets that adjustment at the end as sort of a, I won't say a bum, because it also qualifies for some state subsidy.
My question about the subsidy is, so basically we subtract out everybody's subsidy sort of before we get into the breaking up of, well, who can afford what, right, in terms of the cost sharing formula, right?
So when you say we, you mean what RSU 5 is doing currently?
Yes. Right, because before we even figure out what we're applying percentages to, we're taking out the subsidy, right? We're taking out revenues.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we take out we're taking out all the state subsidy. We're taking out all the miscellaneous revenues. That leaves the portion to be funded at local expense, and that dollar amount has to be divided up.
So, but arguably, that subsidy that comes off the top is driven by these same functions of value and number of kids in Durham. So we're getting more subsidy because of Durham to start.
Yeah, yeah, and
which goes fairly to everybody.
Right,
like that
right.
gets taken right off the top.
Durham would.
That's not
a
applied.
town might say that in its defense, well, I may not have much valuation. What that means is that you as a district receive more in state subsidy by virtue of my being here.
Right, which is exactly the case for Durham, right? Like
and
$3 million
underlying,
of that subsidy
there's
comes
an
from
underlying
Durham.
debate about EPS, which is whether or not the state subsidy ought to be determined on a town-by-town basis, because in some cases it essentially puts some valuation on the shelf and shields it from taxation, whereas if you just took the valuation of the district as a whole and applied a statewide mill rate, it would be more equal. So we don't need to get into that debate, as it happens. So any other questions? All right, now I'm going to make this a little bit simpler.
Oh, thank you.
So first I need an explanation. So the next page is blank. So I called it a worksheet because I had to get it to Ginny in time for her to copy. But then I spent some time taking 3 of these tables and comparing them to what you're doing now. And so you might want to go back to table 2 and put an asterisk or big star next to the 100% valuation model. That's the second table down on table 2. Okay, I used that one. I picked that one. And then I picked on table 3, I picked number 3 and 4, the 75 in the fine print, the 75% valuation, 25% pupil count, and the 50% valuation, 50% pupil count. I thought you might be interested in those, but you could also say I picked them arbitrarily. You could certainly do the calculations, but I think at this point we need to reduce it down to a more finite number of things to make any sense of this. So if someone wants to hand this out, if you don't mind, and maybe the audience would like some, you guys can just pass this down.
I thought he was going to make us do the math ourselves. Have my pencil ready.
Luckily, you have the worksheet. You can do some on your own, and you can find. If I made other mistakes, you can find them.
Ben's like, why
God,
did
I
I
hope I didn't.
volunteer for this?
It's our first night.
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like we're back.
So, really,
It's better than that.
the examples I just gave you are really just the worksheet filled in with a couple of things. Okay. So let's go to the notes at the bottom first. Remember I said, just remember, as you're doing this, phase-in options exist. I know no one likes change, particularly if it increases their taxes, but there are phase-in options. So you could do a 3-year phase-in or a 5-year phase-in, whatever. And the second note is, again, these impacts have not been adjusted to reflect shifts when pre-existing debt is paid in Freeport and in Durham. Okay? Increases in those 2 towns under a selected amendment would be offset when that pre-existing debt is retired. So might offset the panic a little bit. That happened once when I was talking in our office in Portland, and what it was that ship that crashed into the $1 Million Bridge. We could hear it. We could hear it from our office. So, okay. I think we're still in the guarantee period for the construction work, aren't we? Okay, we'll see. Okay, so let's look at this table. What I'm trying to do here is show, well, let's look at a couple of changes and how much would that really change things, okay? And as I did this, I was mindful that Pownell seemed to be paying a little more than either its valuation or its pupil count for reasons that made sense when you formed, because those percentages were just based upon what people had been paying. And I think the thinking was, well, let's assure people that it's the same as what they had before. But maybe that becomes less and less persuasive over time. Perhaps not, but. So the first amendment is from Table 2, as the title says. Remember, that's the one where we say we're going to use the EPS numbers for the portion of our cost that gets some state subsidy. We're going to use the local tax dollar numbers. Think of the EPS numbers as state matching dollars, okay? You've got an allocation. To get the state matching dollars, each town has to raise a certain amount to get the state matching dollars. Let's use the amount that the state says needs to be raised by each town and not use our total required local contribution number. And then apply the formula, in this case, valuation, to the additional local funds. So we've got the 3 towns. We've got what they're paying under the current formula, okay? If you amended it in the way I just described, you have different amounts in the next column, okay? So Durham would go from $4,957,000 to $4,737,000. Freeport would go up from $17,355,000 to $17,692,000, and Pownell would go down slightly from 2.8 million to 2.7 million. The next column is the dollar amount of that increase or decrease. Okay, decreases are in parentheses, increases have no parentheses. Okay, now how many mils is that? Okay, like what does that translate? A dollar amount, those are big numbers, right? $336,000 is a big dollar amount. But what's the tax impact of that? So I've given the mill rate, the adjustment to the mill rate, okay, and then I've said, well, this is what it means for a $100,000 home or a $100,000 other piece of property. So what this change would mean is that Durham's taxes would go down by $62 and change, Freeport's would go up by $24, and Pownell's would go down by $55 for a $100,000 property. Okay? Now, what does that really mean? The last column is how big a change is that in the overall tax burden? And in Durham, it would be a 4.44% decrease, Freeport a 1.94, almost a 2% increase, and Pownell 4.15 decrease in property taxes. So you look at that, you say, well, okay, if I'm in Freeport, I want to be big-minded, but 2% sounds like a lot. You know, why would we be doing that? Maybe there are justifications. Maybe you'd be persuaded. Okay. So I said the next two charts are from Table 3, and I picked the 75% valuation, 25% pupil count. Okay, and again, these all still have the pre-existing debt in them. Again, running through those numbers, what you see if you do that is you have Durham is basically unchanged. Go to the second to last column. Durham taxes on a $100,000 home using this formula would go up only 48 cents on a $100,000 home. Basically a rounding error. All the other changing factors from year to year would completely obscure that, okay? Freeport's would go up $11.86, which is more like a 1% increase instead of a 2% increase. And Pownell's would go down $79, which is 6%, which, you know, gets Pownell much closer to that 10 to 11% as compared to where it is now. And then finally, for comparison, I did one with 50% valuation, 50% pupil count. Again, using the total it should be Amendment C. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the confusion. Amendment C. The third one should say Amendment C. Okay. Okay, so in that one, we have Durham taxes going up 5.9%, which is a fair amount. Freeport's actually going down, and Pownell's going down. All of these show Pownell's going down, which is consistent with what I was saying, that it's currently paying slightly more. And if you want to think of a way to start thinking about this, you might want to look at your current formula, and I would say look at the one in the middle, which, you know, doesn't really change Durham, brings Pownell a little bit more in line with its valuation and pupil count, and results in a 1% tax increase in Freeport that could be phased in over a number of years and would be offset by payoff of existing non-shared debt. Now, I'm not advocating it. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm saying to someone from the outside, maybe what made sense, a lot of sense actually when you started, makes a little bit less sense as you move along. And you may have much more extreme views about the unfairness of this. You know, you may think that we should take a different example and decrease our town's taxes much more, and we don't care if that increases the other towns' taxes, but do try to keep in mind the process that you need to go through in order to implement one of these changes, and just as a practical matter. And I would say also keeping in mind your responsibilities to the district as a whole, which I think is reflected by your existing cost-sharing formula, which is, as I mentioned, pretty close to one based upon valuation. So,
Hi there, Bill. I'd like to ask a quick question. So in terms of what is being valued, is for the valuation, is it all businesses, all residences? Is that how you... So you mentioned under pupil count that a restaurant in one town may be taxed differently than a restaurant. I think Freeport is very different than the other towns. And so to try, I don't think we're comparing apples to oranges here. I also don't have the information to know how our businesses are being taxed, like who's getting a tax break, how much is LL Bean actually paying in taxes.
Sure.
So I don't know that we have enough information.
So the towns generally tax all their property proportionately according to valuation. Okay, so, and people might disagree about the methodology used for valuation. Okay, that maybe they might feel that the assessors should value commercial property higher or lower, and residential higher or lower. Now, there are some exceptions, as I mentioned. There's tree growth, there's farm and open space, there are these exceptions, and there are things like TIF districts that might, tax increment financing districts that might lower taxes. But in general, the amount allocated to a town is going to be shared among all the property owners, be they residential, industrial, or other commercial, according to the valuation of that property. Now, when the district uses valuation, the district uses state-adjusted valuation figures. All the towns report their valuations to the state treasurer, to the Department of Revenue, excuse me. The Department of Revenue wasn't born yesterday, and they look at those numbers and they say, well, we're going to look at some recent sales of property and we're going to adjust those numbers to what we think are the real valuation figures, okay? And when those are the valuation figures the district uses. Those are the valuation figures I've used here. The town's own valuations may not have caught up to where the state has adjusted their valuations. But that being said, the town's attempt to tax proportionally. The other thing that happens is sometimes property on the waterfront goes up more rapidly in a recovery than property elsewhere, or maybe it goes down more rapidly during a recession. So towns probably struggle to keep up with those, changes. But I think that's a matter for the town and the assessor and the property owners to work out. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
Did you see any discrepancies between the state valuation that you used to basically populate these formulae and the town valuations, the actual valuations
I haven't
that each
even
town
looked
is
at the
using?
town valuations. We've
Okay.
only looked at state valuations. Those are the only numbers that are used for purposes of school district taxation, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
Okay.
Because I think that changing at different rates that you mentioned is exactly what we saw a couple of years ago, where we had vast differences in the tax increases or decrease. Well, they were all increases, but increases relative to our budget. So a couple of years ago, some folks were certainly on the board then. We had something like a 3 or 4%, school budget increase, but because Freeport's valuation had dropped and Durham's valuation actually relative to where it had been the prior, obviously not relative to Freeport, but where it had been the prior year, went up. So we had a 9% tax increase that year because of, one going down and one going up was sort of the worst case scenario for the one going up. So when everybody's going up, it sort of goes. It's not, no, well, the valuation changes year to year, but they actually have implemented, correct me if I'm wrong, a trailing 3-year average now to try and soften some of those like peaks and valleys that people were seeing. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, it's going to be, I think 2 years. It's going to be. So the state valuation figures are adjusted valuations, and they also use a term called fiscal capacity. The current definition of fiscal capacity is a 3-year average to sort of cushion those changes. I believe it's changing next year to 2 years. It has ranged from 1 year to 3 years in the time that I've been looking at this. Yours uses the most recent valuation. That part of your formula does fluctuate as valuations change. That member share of the total required local contribution, that was the second component of your cost sharing formula, because it's based on relative valuations. So as those change relative to, and it's not just a question of yours going up, it's whether yours is going up faster or slower than the other towns to change your percentage, right? So those actually are responsive to changes over time. The additional local monies portion uses those fixed numbers established in the base year. And actually, the more time goes on, it would actually be rather remarkable if those numbers continued to bear close relationship to either, well, to valuation. I mean, it would just be a remarkable coincidence. I suppose it could be, because those weren't based on valuation. They were simply based upon what towns were paying towards additional local funds before the district was formed. So they're not, I think they're not terribly off now, but they seem to be slightly off. So, but to answer your question, that portion is someone's question. That portion is fixed. Yes, Kate.
I think also that when you were mentioning the analogy with the restaurants paying equal amount, you were talking about if we were looking at taxation on a district-wide level instead of town by town, that the two restaurants would be paying the same amount.
In a pupil count scenario,
Right.
they're not paying the same amount.
Right.
In a valuation standpoint, they would be.
Yeah, an evaluation standpoint. I'd like to use restaurant instead of homes, because when people talk about our kids, why should we be paying for their kids versus our kids? And it really goes to the mindset of, are we providing a service on a town-by-town basis or on a district-by-district basis? I personally think the better argument is, if you're providing the service on a district-wide basis, the taxation system should be based on a district, not a town. If you have a municipal school system, then that would make more sense to me. Others may disagree with me. And again, there's also the reality of getting towns with disparate numbers to come together. So there are compromises made.
And excuse me while I try to grapple with this. So the valuation may be the same from town to town, but what you're actually taking in for tax revenues may be different from town to town. So we could be, the valuation, we could be getting a lot less tax based on our arrangements with the commercial and, LL Bean or anybody else up and down Main Street here. We could be taking in less taxes, but our valuation would be the same here versus Pownell versus, does that make sense? People are looking at me. So the taxes are different, but the valuations would be the same.
Valuations are different for each town too. So like,
well, this says a restaurant in one town may be taxed differently than a restaurant with the same valuation in another town. So
okay, I think of it as a municipal basis. So like each town has more, like Freeport has more value.
I think what Sarah means. Go ahead.
Sorry. I think what Kate's trying to say is the state can change the valuations in different towns. So that's one concept of valuation. But I think what the example you're referring to is just a restaurant worth $500,000 in Durham versus a restaurant worth $500,000 in Freeport.
So
there's sort of like different
we have
concepts.
a lot of valuation in Freeport with our retail, right? But that doesn't mean we're taking in the same amount of tax that is equal to that valuation, which would allow for us to be paying so much more for our school district. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So basically the TIF districts. I mean, those.
So that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't feel like it doesn't feel apples to apples.
I think another factor of that is that there's the land is more developed in Freeport than in the other two towns. So you may see in Pownell huge tracts of land which has conservation easements, for example, or farm easements or tree growth easements. So the valuation for those pieces of land obviously is much lower than that same size piece of land if it's been subdivided and built upon, which is more likely to be the case in Freeport.
So are we saying that we need like town assessor and tax experts to come tell us their tax system in order to do our job of coming up with a fair plan?
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is I don't know what our tax revenues are. I know, we are comparing valuation, but not revenues. And I think they're different things.
Well, I think you also, looking at the mill is very different in the towns, right? The tax rates are, I think they're very different between the towns. It's one of the difficult parts of the RSU is because we're not all taxed the same, and we can't be all taxed the same because, Durham and Pownell have no police. We have, volunteer firefighters. We don't have the services, but we also don't have the corresponding, cost of that. So it's hard to separate out, and what the town decides to do from a tax incentive standpoint. Kate.
And on the revenue side, you're only taking in what you need, so it's based on whatever your town or your school budget is. It's not like Freeport collects taxes based on some arbitrary mill rate they've decided. The mill rate is set based on whatever they need to raise for that year. Yeah.
But what would be interesting is to find out what the ratio is of collected revenue versus valuation for each town. I think that's what
I
Sarah's
don't really
trying to say.
understand why that matters, actually. What the revenue, I don't understand what revenues play in the discussion.
Because the funding formula is based upon valuation and not revenue collected. So it will be interesting to find out if the valuation is an accurate representation of how affordable it is for each town, its portion of the funding formula.
Well, but if you're only collecting what you need, then you're going to get back to the same spot. What might be interesting is to say, I'm picking numbers. Freeport's valuation is $100 million. $25 million of that is taken off the tax rolls and TIFs. That might be interesting information to know. That so then we're basing it on $100 million of taxation, of valuation, but it's got to be collected from only $75 million worth of landowners. That might be I don't know if that's even figure outable.
Right.
But
and then, you've also got, we do have all this retail here, and so we're looking only at valuation, but then we have all these services like, the roads that need to be cleared and the fire and everything else because we have all this here. So it's, again, I don't think we're looking.
Yep.
Bill, have you ever encountered, another district wanting to see revenue comparisons as opposed to valuation? Is this like a totally different new idea
unique
in your mind, or is this like, yeah, that has been considered by other places?
Well, I guess I would say that the actual impact is going to depend upon a number of individual town decisions or realities that have been made or exist that you have no control over. So let's say, for example, in a particular town, a number of people are unable to pay their taxes. Well, their collections are going to go down. Is that a factor you should consider? Probably ought to be out. It probably ought to be. It's outside of your control. It's certainly, I wouldn't say it's within the town's control. They have remedies that towns are reluctant to exercise to get people to pay their taxes, understandably. But then there are things like TIF districts, which presumably were decisions of the town. At the same time, they're realities, right? So that may affect. I tend to think that those differences are going to be small, and I have not had in the discussions I've been involved in about cost sharing formulas and changes to cost sharing formulas, those issues have not been considered by school boards.
I don't know how much this has to do with it or not, and I don't know the specifics, but I do know that, or my understanding is from people talking to me years ago, that the 3 towns, when they came together and were formulating this, and you said it's not like one you've ever particularly seen before, my understanding is that they really, really struggled with putting this together. And I think it would be worthwhile to at least ask those folks how they came up with the formula that they did.
And I think in the handout called FAQs, F-A-Q-S, the first 3 or 4 pages are a discussion of that.
So I'm curious to know, did you find this information at the state through the DOE, or were you able to contact the people who actually negotiated the RPC?
Actually, Michelle provided me with that.
So the question's for you.
Where'd you get that?
I think
They were part of
the
they were
information.
part of the plan, right?
Yeah, the copy of the plan.
FAQs, weren't they part of the original?
So
No,
this
no.
is what went out to the towns just before everything happened. So just before all the voting happened and everything, this is the explanation of how, of the formula.
Of the vote on the formula, okay.
And by saying yours is unusual, it isn't a criticism. It may in fact be brilliant. I mean, this is a big issue, obviously, and it got the district together. So, yeah. So, and you may decide you don't want to make a change or shouldn't make a change. That's okay also, you know.
Do we have to do something? Because there was also discussions about, like, do we have to adjust or vote to adjust, or, you know, is sort of this process of review and looking at other options, does that meet our requirement? Because I know you couldn't change it for a certain number of time, but then
Right.
there was sort of like,
It was fixed
you
for 3
shall
years.
or something,
And the state is
or you may.
it's not requiring us to change.
No.
This is, it's part of the RPC agreement that after 5 years or 6 years to take a look at it again.
Yeah, you're not required to make a change. It might be helpful to, if you don't have a vote, the question will be whether you've ever put it behind you, I suppose. So, you know, you might want to have a vote for that reason, to, you know, after you've thoroughly considered it. Really, that's up to you.
So last year, the request was made that we look at this, and so we had Mark Eastman do a presentation for the newer members on the board to the Finance Committee. And so he did kind of look at it and explain it to the Finance Committee. But then there was a request that we have a full board discussion on it, so that's why we're here.
And I believe Mark was your facilitator when the RSU was formed. So
Was he really?
I thought so. No? I thought it. I think I saw it on something I read, so I'd have to double check that. But there were a group of 5 or 6 facilitators around the state that were helping different districts, and Mark was certainly one of them.
Just kind of I guess sort of a comment to all about the question of, you know, valuation and revenues from town to town. It sounds like the use of the state valuation was kind of an attempt to smooth that out a bit, just like you're saying, so that each town can't play a valuation game. And that seems to, you know, I know we're using the word fair a lot tonight, that seems to sort of fair it out a bit to say, you know, we're not going to, you know, take one town's word over another. We're going to go with the generally accepted number. And that's kind of how I understand it, why that component's there, but
right, because
to take revenue out of the picture.
It would be possible for unscrupulous towns to underreport their valuations for purposes of state revenue sharing and for purposes of school costs, things like school formulas, for example. So clearly none of these three communities would do that. But
Well, and also we're all on sort of different cycles of how frequently we revalue. I know Pownell just went through a revalue. Durham did it a couple of years ago. Some towns do it all the time. So, I mean, it does seem to sort of take out the variability of that.
Right. I think it provides everyone with sort of an assurance of a more or less level playing field as far as that factor is concerned.
Yeah.
I really think that, like this paragraph says, that pupil count is probably the most practical. And like it says, in some places, high valuation, low pupil count towns could not easily be encouraged to join school districts with low valuation and high pupil counts, and vice versa. And I think in relation to what we're paying in Freeport, I think we're high valuation and kind of medium-ish pupil count. So I think that's having some sort of way of factoring in pupil count makes more sense for Freeport.
So, Table 4, the filled-in version that you gave us, are these your recommendations that we look at? Or did you just pull these examples for us to understand how it all works, or are you asking us to consider Amendment A or B or C?
No, I'm not asking you to consider any particular amendment, but I am simultaneously trying to provide you with a possible approach. So if you think that the unshared debt should continue to be unshared, so that's sort of one decision. Another sort of small step, just sort of looking at it, might be to bring Pownell down slightly so that it's not above its valuation and its student count. That might be, if it can be done without too much tax impact on other towns, and how might that be achieved. And then I wanted to show alternatives so that you could see that there are real dollar consequences to them, and have you think about that in light of the process for getting amendments approved, and all remaining one happy, unified family while you're considering a topic that affects your children and your taxes, two subjects about which few people don't get much more passionate. So I'm just trying to provide some sort of framework for you to begin to look at alternatives. And as I've said, I'm not here to advocate for any one or the other, but at the same time, thinking about also what might be doable if you wish to do anything at all. Perhaps much more is doable. I don't know. Okay.
And none of these scenarios will change what the school district is actually getting. It's just who is paying for it. So the children aren't going to be suffering here.
It may change. It may change what the towns are willing to pay for it. So,
okay.
Yes and no is the answer.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Bill, in looking back at the original group, they really were an extraordinary group of people, and we looked at, because I attended almost all of those meetings, we looked at a dozen variations of, like are being presented here. They put an awful lot of work into it, and it's amazing, and I think that's why the numbers remain so close. Because.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, Maddie?
So why is it written in the agreement that we should review it after 6 years? I mean, just so that to make sure it's still fair, or was there something in that? And I'm just wondering, is there something in that they knew would phase out and really should require us to redo it?
I think it was a brand new world. They were trying to invent something.
Whereby you get a chance to examine it.
It was like a safety clause.
Right.
Yeah, because they were trying it for the first time. So they were like, hey, if something is not working right, we want to build in a formal
So we're just
touchstone to
meeting that. We're not necessarily believing that something has changed to such a degree that we must look at. Well, I'm presuming we're going to talk about this at some later meeting and decide if we want to take action or not, or are we doing that now?
I would say, given the rest of the agenda, we probably don't want to undertake that discussion now. But I think, this was the first step to try and bring everybody up to speed on how we got to where we are today with the current system, because I certainly know for newer folks on the board that haven't necessarily dove into the original RPC agreement, it's a bit of a black box, right? So I think Bill has done a great job of bringing us all up to our a remedial level of understanding of the EPS formula. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on the subject yet, but
read footnote 2.
So I think this was just our first step. And then we can, as a board, decide, maybe this is a workshop where we talk about, do we feel like there's enough changes in how things have gone in the last 5 or 6 years that it warrants review, and maybe we have that that vote on, do we think it needs some sort of change, and we can go from there. So
I would advocate for having that conversation. I would like to especially hear from the panel board members, because they are the ones who are basically at a disadvantage with the current formula. So I definitely would be in favor of having that conversation.
Yep.
Yeah. And I want to know when it would happen, because I'm looking at the agendas from now on out until the end of the year, and they're packed. So I don't want this to just basically fizzle away and then we never take it up again.
Yep. Exactly. We got to use it before we lose it. Yeah. So, I don't have the schedule in front of me, so I'm not going to say what day it's going to be on, but I would envision we would be doing this school year. Was that? Well, I mean. So we've got 5 months left of our school year to do this, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be the last one in June, but I don't know where we fit it in at this point. So we'll get it in.
Does it take that much time? Like, we all have to read this at home and process it, because I didn't receive this early. Did you guys?
No.
Okay. I was like, oh no, I missed it.
Yeah, and I have to apologize for that.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm sure Ginny was like beating him to get it.
Suffice to say, it was very complicated, and it's a busy time of year.
I'm sure.
I did my best.
So, for process, what I would like as a board member is to have some sort of discussion next week about...
We don't meet again until January.
Oh, we don't meet again until January? Okay, so our next meeting... So, I mean, could it be as basic as our next meeting, we have a discussion where board members share their feelings on whether or not they want to open up a reevaluate, like, do something more than just say, let's stay the same. Like, it's a decision, is it worth it to, change the formula, or do we want to vote to stay the same? And then it's like you have a majority, or I don't know, maybe it's a special vote, but anyway, you have board
I think it's only if we want to change I don't think it has to be any sort of special vote to decide if we want to change it.
But then it's like, okay, then you have to make time, and it's a big process.
Sure.
Or you don't, and then you're kind of on to the next. I mean, that's...
Well, yeah, I mean, the question is, right.
So how much...
Right.
I mean,
do people
really
feel like they have enough information to make that decision?
Oh.
I would agree that it could be a very simple and short conversation at our next meeting. I mean, we go home, we read this, we hear from the people in our towns, who are watching this video. I'm sure there are hundreds of them who either say it's good, or we hear, you guys need to look at this because I care about this, and then we come in and we have a vote about if we want to look at it and what that process would be.
I would just like to point out that we've never had a simple and short conversation about anything.
We can't even have a conversation about when we're going to have the conversation. So our next meeting, we currently have a technology report, a nutrition report, the athletics report, the instructional support report, and the community programs report. It's currently on the agenda.
When I said simple, I just meant that we wouldn't necessarily do all this work. It would just be do we want to move forward or not?
Right. No, I understand.
Or phase one of that discussion.
Right.
And I'd want to hear from each board member their sentiment. And then,
Well, we all know we can't force people to share their opinions.
Oh.
We can ask them, but they are not obligated.
Have the opportunity to share their.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I just looked at this as like a presentation that we were getting information, and I just didn't personally feel like it was something that was going to become like a big discussion. That was just I just thought it was like information, and we're required to look at it, and I would have to agree that I think that the rest of the agendas for the rest of are very packed, but I didn't find this to be of like imminent, just from listening.
Yeah, I mean, we do hear from folks that want to know whether we've reviewed it and whether, similar to, I think, to, not that it necessarily has to be at the scope of what we did for the survey last year, but, have you thought about changing the name of the high school? Yep, we talked about it. We did some research on it. We went through that, and we decided we're not going to, right? So I see sort of the cost-sharing formula as a similar subject that we hear sort of every year, 6 months. Have you guys looked at the formula? Are you comfortable with it? And I'm not opposed to us saying yes, we've put it to bed and we're okay with where it is, or yeah, we're going to look at options.
But absent at least one more conversation, we can't say we looked at it and we decided.
I'm not saying we just shouldn't have another conversation.
Okay, great.
I'm just saying that the January 10th meeting might not be the one where it fits the best. So, but I do appreciate the desire to have the conversation sooner rather than later, so we don't start losing the information that we've all gained. So, we will fit it into the work plan somewhere soon. All right, perfect. I'm going to take, never mind.
I don't want to drag this on.
Good. So, moving on. Thank you
you so much.
Yeah, that was great.
I would recommend putting the administrator's reports ahead.
Given the time at 8:15, we're going to hop Ray and Jen in front of Becky's info under the superintendent's report. So, Ray, you're up first.
Thanks for the heads up.
Unless you don't want to. We were trying to help you guys get out of here. We know you come prepared.
And I think you have everything that is going up there, so. You are the presentation, Lindsay. So I'm connected, yeah. Didn't see that one.
Oh, yeah. It's like really up there.
So, Ray Grogan, Freeport Middle School principal. Last year we had 3 building goals. 2 were really very similar, really the same goal but for different subject areas. The reading goal, which was really for our language arts, social studies, and science teachers. We had the goal of all students meeting or exceeding their NWA growth targets, or 60% of all students meeting or exceeding their NWA growth targets. And that really looked at the the reading instruction in the language arts classes and the informational reading that was going on in the science and social studies class. As you can see there on the green column on the right, we definitely exceeded that and did quite well with that. And I do think that it was the combination of all the subjects working together. We did bring an outside consultant who has continued to work with us, Kelly Smith, to work directly with our science and social studies teachers on some informational reading and writing, and that has gone very well. We had a similar goal in math for all kids to meet or exceed their NWA growth goal targets, or 60% to meet or exceed, and you can see, you know, much closer to the 60% target looking at that. And last year was year one of the Big Ideas pilot in 7th grade. This year we're moving into the Big Ideas in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, you know, all the way. So, you know, we're still continuing to focus on math and you know, where we're doing this. And the same with language arts. Everything that you see in both of these slides are things that are continuing this year in both reading and in math. It's not something that just goes away because it's not presented as a goal. If anything, math is even a bigger focus with the new curriculum that is coming, or that is here. This is, I just want to give you a little snapshot of kind of some of the data that we do look at when we look at our NWA scores in particular. The grid that you see there is just a quick grid that comes from the NWA website, and what it is each one of those little dots is a kid in either math or language arts. The kids that are at the highest achievement levels are all the way to the right. The kids that are at the lowest achievement levels are left on the left side. This happens to be just the last year's, or this year's 7th grade students. And I could have picked any grade, but I can't get all 3 grades into the same picture. So I did just pick one grade to kind of illustrate. And you can see that, you know, based on the national norms, you know, the vast majority of our kids are well over that 50th percentile, that vertical line that goes down the middle. I then added the line at that 75th percentile to kind of break up our really top end in the next group in there. And you can see that top 25% nationally is where we have the largest concentration of kids in our school. And then, you know, if you look at the bottom 25% nationally all the way to the left, that is where we have the fewest students there. And obviously you want to have more and more kids above the line than below the line. The kids above the line have made their growth targets. The kids below the line have not made their growth targets. And then when we kind of look at it by the different achievement levels, you look at that top, the chart on the right, but it says 76 to 99. Those are groups that we have historically done very well with, and we continue to do very well with. 86% of those top end students are making their goals, 70% in math. The 50th to 75th percentile, those kids that how they score nationally, you know, still, you know, doing very well at 49 and 59. But then when we drop, you know, to kids below grade level, you can see where our percentages of growth definitely drop off for those students. So like that is something that, you know, moving forward that, you know, we have been looking at, you know, increased RTI, increased other services to really help focus for those kids, because we don't, you know, we can't afford to have those kids falling further behind. Those are the kids that are already coming to us behind, and we have to make sure they don't fall further behind. So that's definitely a focus for us moving forward, and how we address that to have those percentages look more similar for all kids of all ability levels. There are.
Guessing one's math and one's ELA.
Very good. And this is how I remember it. The plus sign is math. But yeah, in this, so I can pull this chart for each grade level. I can't pull this chart for the whole school. And I only put this chart in just so you could visualize kind of what is there. I'm a very visual person, so I did put that in there just for the visual of that, you know, those top end kids, they are above the line. The lower end kids, academically on achievement levels, we have too many below the line. Yes, Lindsay.
We spent a whole night talking about growth achievement targets, and
So
is there like a one sentence explanation for what?
give me 3 or 4.
Okay, 3 or 4. I mean, I apologize. I feel like I should have it in my mind, but it's fuzzy.
So for every kid's score, the NWA sets where that kid should be at the end of the year based on what grade they're in and what score they're at.
So it's not that if you were necessarily sort of a low achiever, right? You don't necessarily have to get the same score as the high achiever to have met your goal. They take into account.
So
where you
perfect
start.
example, like if I look at some of those green dots at the bottom there, those are probably scores around 200 on the math. Their growth target for a year of growth is probably going to be around 10 points, 8 to 10 points. The plus sign at the very top there, the highest plus sign you can see all the way right, is probably an NWA score of about 260, which is really off the chart. And their growth target is probably going to be 2 points. Because it's really hard to move, and they don't need to move enough as much to get that full year of growth. So like in general, a third grader's growth target is higher based on the way the NWA works than a typical middle schooler or high schooler.
So these kids of that bottom there, you've got the ones to the
Yep.
left, they probably didn't go up very much at all. The ones to the right went up.
Yeah, the ones above the line all went up at least their required amount, and the other ones did not. And some, sadly, do move backwards. Like we really want to make sure they're all making their growth target, and secondly, at least moving forward. But for a variety of reasons, not every child does make the progress that we hope they have.
So you could have the same amount of growth in actual points, right? You could each grow 3.
Yes.
And the 3 for the person on the top end is above their goal of 2. But
Exactly.
The 3 for that person is well below where you expect it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But the person at the bottom would have to meet the growth target of 10, which is a really huge growth target. It only has to go from 200 to 210, while the other one up there is already at 260. So
No, I get it, yeah.
63, not.
And like we know like what skills by band is. So you have a kid at 200 to get to 210. These are the skills they're lacking to get to that next level. And our third and final goal for last year was really around your all's Pride and Unity one, where just trying to create more opportunities for both middle school kids to have opportunities to do things together, come together. None of our 3 towns are towns that are based on neighborhoods, so just creating social opportunities for kids outside of the school day to come and meet. And you can see the list of all the ones we had. And then I did throw some of the down at the bottom that I'm not sure I'd really count as social activities, but they were things that were kids to get together with that. And what we really tried to do is, we talked about this at the PTC, we talked to those other groups, is create things that will live on as opposed to me creating things to make the goal. It was more, all right, these are things that will live on with groups taking ownership of them, not me taking ownership of them.
So bottle flipping's becoming an annual event.
That was our least successful one we had. That one is not coming back. Yeah, that was not our most successful, even though the newspaper thought it was, or whatever that picked it up. So, and so now on to this year's goal. One of the things that we noticed in our transition to standards and proficiency is that we last year completely separated out the standard content grade and the habits of work grade. So the kids got 2 completely separate grades, so we could truly see what does this child know in math. Not are they a good homework kid, but they bomb the test and we'll give them a C. Separated those 2 out. And one of the things we noticed as a school was that we had, some kids saying, this doesn't count. I don't need to do this. And then they would be surprised when they get to the test and they don't do well. because they haven't done the homework, the classwork, the things that lead up to it to build up those, those skills to do that. So one of the things that we've really tried to focus on this year is, when we started working on the end of last year, worked through the summer on it, working on it this year, is creating a culture in the building of increased habits of work, placing a greater importance on it culturally, placing value of it, where we're placing it in Power School, the fact that teachers are grading it more regularly, adding eligibility as a requirement through the preparedness standards and habits of work. Last year, habits of work was not part of the honor roll. This year, habits of work is part of the honor roll. Under the actions and strategies, I'm not going to read them all to you, but really trying to make a cultural shift so that process of leading up to an assessment becomes more ingrained in the kids, so they have better habits to get to doing better at the on the assessment at the end. With that, yes, no.
We heard from Durham School last meeting about their habits of work, and they showed us the scoring criteria. Is that
identical?
Fantastic. Thanks.
So everything in Power School for our two schools is similar. We don't have a separate Freeport and Durham. Everything links in together. We have the same grading system, the same reporting, and that our scoring criteria for all content and habits of work are similar. Durham has done some great work with the habits of work that has really, a lot of those started in Durham, worked their way to Freeport Middle School, worked their way into the high school and some parts of that. So it's been a very nice sharing that they have done with that. And our teachers greatly appreciated a lot of that work being done with that, and now it's really taking that and culturally putting that into the school to do that. So that's really what we're looking at as a goal to help support the transition to standards. And with that said, the goals, so the teachers, this is all of their individual goals and their professional growth stuff. So the end evaluation is looking at the kids and their understanding, their using, and their doing, because they have to report in May and June. Ultimately, we're looking for a lot more than that, though. What we would be looking for is not only what's in here as evidence, but looking at, this is where our MEA results were, and the goal is that there would be growth in these scores will go up. If the kids are practicing more and more ready for our assessments, we would naturally expect our MEA scores to go up, and we would naturally expect the percentage of kids that are getting 3s in the content area to go up as well. So even though that's not listed as this is the measure, because when we're required to measure, we're not going to know those results, and the teachers won't be able to put that in for that. But we would expect both content standards, a higher percentage of kids to have 3s, and the RMEA results to go up.
So these are meeting standards?
These are the MEAs, the 3s and 4s.
That's state standard, at or above state
Yeah.
standard.
Yep. And then I just wanted to give you the quick overview of how kids check, just so you all know, because I know some of you have kids in the building, but some of you don't, just so you have a quick overview of it. When a kid logs in, or a parent, this is the first page that they will see, a list of all their classes in order. If you click on the expand all blue button on the right, or click.
That's the order they have the classes.
That's the order they have the classes in. Yeah. So that's this child's schedule. Yeah. So if you click on either the class or expand all, then you see a breakdown of the standards. So when I click into the next one, I click on the Spanish one there, and I see at the top, World Language Habits of Work. So this child has a 3 in habits of work based on the 3 in respect, preparedness, engagement. Actually, they don't have an engagement grade yet, but they have a determination grade. And then I go down to World Language Content grade. They overall have a 3.5. And then you see the interpretive communication standards been graded at a 3.5. The interpersonal and presentational communication standards have not been scored yet this year, and the conventions one is a 3.
So would you expect by T3 all of these, or
I would.
they would all be graded in?
Well, that was my question, because I know I've gone in before and seen missing things.
Missing standards.
Missing standards, missing grades, things haven't been entered.
So
How
that's
often
something
do
that
they
we
do
have. So one of the things we've asked Power School to do, because they tell us that none of those little things with lines show up, and we say they do, because we would prefer it just to have the ones that have been graded so far in the year, and that is something Power School's working on with us.
Okay, because I know I've gone in and checked and there's no grade, and then I know I emailed you, and by the time you go look, it's in there, but it wasn't there when I looked, so I didn't know if that. It wasn't. So I didn't know if that was a Power School issue or.
Well, that might be the teacher entering the grade.
Well, and that's what I wonder. How often are they expected to go in and enter and update those things?
We really want teachers, depending on the assignment, like homework, if they're doing the homework and teachers grade the homework differently, that should really be within 24 to 48 hours. You know, a language arts teacher on essays is not going to be 48 hours, you know, with that. But, you know, within the week it should be with that. So, like, getting rid of those lines is something that we're working on with Power School. That's an active work request. Yes?
I'm not familiar with the middle school report cards yet, so I'm wondering, this is like a top page, but you're saying there's another page you can drill down to with assignments that roll up into this? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Perfect.
I will know soon.
You will
year.
know soon. So this is, and you can see, like, this person has 2 standards graded, a 3 in conventions and a 3.5 in interpretive communication. You average the 2, you get 3.25. 3.25 rounds up to a 3.5.
So it goes to 1 decimal.
We have it set. So, and when we started this a couple years ago, this is all you could do. Now there's a little more flexibility in there. Is we have it that it's going to 4, 3.5, 3, 2.5, 2, 1.5. Yeah. So we have it on the 0.5. If you click on the grades and attendance page, you see once again the list of classes in order. And then if the kids or the parents click on the little I here, that's when they see the full list of assignments that they have with the category that they go to, with the grade on that assignment. And then the blue rectangle in the middle, if you click on that, it breaks down to tell you which specific standard or indicator it's linked to. And then that's just back to the list of standards page. So that's just the 2-minute overview of kind of what a middle school grade book looks like for, you know, anyone in Durham or in Freeport.
And this is similar to what you have on YouTube.
Hey, I like that marketing. So I have made multiple YouTube videos that I've linked to the emails I've sent out to parents to take them through this tutorial, of which one will come out tomorrow, because report cards, we're sending the email tomorrow saying T1 has ended, teachers have finalized their grades, please go look in there. And there will be that link in there tomorrow.
Are they all on the same period, like T1 trimester?
So K-8, we're all on trimesters. The days that they end may vary slightly by school. Some schools are more concerned about snow days than others. For us, where we rotate each trimester a new unified art, it would, the last trimester might have 5 extra days if we didn't readjust for snow days. So we do readjust, and I'm not sure all the elementary do. Exactly, because you probably haven't. So like we closed our grades, now the teachers have a couple days to finalize.
As a parent, I don't know when is the most effective time to be doing house.
Yeah.
Because things are in progress,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you get your final grade, and it's like, I feel like I often, maybe I miss an email, because you probably sent an email, but it's like, you want to be able to remind your
So, and I think it varies from kid to kid. I'll speak to you as a parent, having 3 kids that are in power school getting graded. I have one of my kids set so I get alerts every time a grade goes in. I don't have it for my other 2. Yeah. So I have an alert every time a grade is added. I get an alert on my phone. So when a grade goes in that's blank, I can go to that child. What happened here? You need to get this in. And it's more just looking at, and I do try to, as a parent, every week or 2, making sure I'm checking in on all 3 of them just to see where they are, if there's any holes or different things. So, that's just what I do as a parent. So here, and only in about half the classes do they show up like this. The other half, they don't. They just show up the ones that are graded. On this page, really all you need to worry about is, are there 2s, 2.5s, something like that. It's the actual grade that's in there. It's back, if I come back here, like if you look at that page right there, if there's either, 0, then a 4, something to be concerned about, or just a blank line in a, that's 2 weeks, the date is 2 weeks ago and the teacher hasn't put a grade in, you might want to go ask your child, has the teacher not graded and put it in, or did you not hand that in? And the teacher just hasn't put a 0 in for you.
What's a flag? Flag,
So those are, it's cut off the bottom, but there's a whole bunch of codes like late, missing, excluded. There's a whole bunch of codes that can go in for that.
I think it's worth noting too that the app for Power School is vastly different than how it shows up here.
The app is much different.
And it's harder to figure all that out.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you showed this because now I'm going to look on my computer for that one because
no, and
the
I will
app
say,
is
I think Naomi is exactly right. The app is actually different in Apple and Android. For that, it shows up slightly different with that. The phone I find best for just looking at assignments that come in because it gives you an alert of how many new assignments have been graded. That's really what I click in on my phone, where if I'm actually looking at grades and content, I will log in to the computer. Okay.
On the standards page, should there always be a grade with the content grade? Because sometimes I have grades in my children's report card for like some of the.
I think at K5, and Cynthia
they
might
don't
be able
roll
to
up.
answer this better. I think at K5 they don't fill up to a language arts or a math grade. So I think K5 it does not go to an overall class grade. They leave it at the standards, and then then starting at the middle schools is where we have class grades.
Okay, maybe I was pointing the wrong thing because I don't actually probably don't even have content grade on there.
Yeah.
So we have like interpretive communication, presentational communication. Sometimes there will be grades for like 1.1 and 1.2, but nothing for 1. Like it doesn't.
On the elementary.
Is that something I should maybe? It's supposed to be at.
I don't think. I think that's the way they purposely have it not feeding up. Okay. I think that's intentional on the K5, if I remember right from my discussions with Emily and Lisa. But that's something I think we can follow up on. But I think that is the intentional way that they did not want it feeding up all the way. I don't think that's a Power School issue. We have the choice on how far we want it to feed up.
So Ray, a couple of questions about this slide. You said that you round up and you round down, and I have heard concerns about the rounding up and rounding down. In fact, some kids, I asked my son today, do you know how these grades are averaged? And he said, yeah, they just make the average and they plug it in and say, well, no, let's go look at it. Actually, if you get a 3.3, you'll get a 3.5. If you get a 3.24, you get a 3. And a lot of parents don't know about it. A lot of kids don't know about it. And those who do know about it don't feel that that's fair. So is there any way that at some point we can have 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, or something that's finer gradation than just the 5, meaning 0.5 intervals? Because you get a whole range of abilities lumped into the same grade. And that's not very good for motivation.
If I could say something real quick, I was one of the first grades that they implemented this system, and at that time it was that. And we ended up getting like really obscure grades like 3.44 or something, or like a 3.7, and it made all of us more upset to not know what we were really being graded on at that point, rather than just rounding up or down, because then it gives you a clear target of where you're trying to strive for and where you're gonna be held back because you're not meeting that standard, I guess. So from a parent's perspective, I understand that, but from a student's perspective, I actually really prefer that, just because it gives you a little bit more of an understanding of what's going to happen when these grades are going to get put in, if that makes sense.
The issue is that you don't know how the average was arrived at, because I don't see why it would be more obscure to have more gradation in the system. I mean, as long as the kids know exactly which are the assignments and whether it's a content or a how grade, then it shouldn't be more obscure. It would just give you an average that is more defined than just getting lumped into the next grade up or the next grade down.
Well, like a 2.7, is that what you're saying? Like, what's the 2.7? Is that meets the standard?
Yeah, exactly. It didn't give us a lot to pinpoint and find a clear grade which we're going for.
I understand what you mean. Yeah. So how about if you had a range? I mean, you meet at 3, but then 3, whatever.
I mean, I think right now, the kid that has a 2.8 loves the system. Kid that has a 3.2 hates the system. You know, just depending on which side of the round you're on. But I think to answer your question, I think that is something that probably needs to be a further discussion. You know, as we do have discussions, you know, with administrators, you know, about how we look at things that, as Power School puts more and more things on the table as possibilities for that. Because I think Ben was part of our dual currency year that we tried, and we got student feedback on that and went away from it, you know, with that. So
and then another question about that, I see that it's not unusual for habits of work to be at 3 and for content grades to, you know, there to be higher grades, a little more nuance. And I have asked what actually constitutes a meet the standard for how. And it's really difficult to exceed the standard. So I've heard, say, from one of my sons that, well, if you are prepared and you bring all your work and your homework and you have read what you needed to read and clearly you've done the work that's required to participate in class, you get a 3. And if you do more than that, we don't know what that should be, the more than that. And in fact, that some teachers even say, well, you know, you get a 3 if you're prepared, and then if you bring your water bottle and snack, then you get a 4. I mean, there's things that...
a snack.
Right.
No, I hear what you're saying. So one of the things on the first part of what you said is the content grades, the 3.5s and the 4s, is one of the things I have, you know, worked with the teachers on over the last couple of weeks is just making sure that they, on every assessment, there is a reasonable path to a 4, because, you know, there can be a path to a 4, but if it's unreasonable, who really cares if you have a path or not? And the teachers felt very comfortable that all the assessments that they're giving, there isn't a reasonable path, and there's normally, you know, there's always kids getting the 3.5s and the 4s on assessments. It's not all the kids, but there's definitely some kids doing there on the content. So on the content side, I think that's an area that we are doing well with, something we've definitely improved with over the years. On the habits of work, that is a discussion that we have had really this week with teachers, looking at specifically the preparedness rubric itself. Looking at the preparedness rubric, the 3 language in it uses the word usually. The 4 language uses the word always. So what we talked about as teachers is that if you have a kid that has been doing their homework and handing it in and coming prepared to class with a pencil and everything all this time, they're probably at the always now. So those should start to become 4s, because I do think that we probably did have a lot of teachers to start the year that were looking at that as just as a 3, and we got to stop at a 3. But I think that those are discussions that have just started. Let's look at that rubric. The rubric says, and based on the rubric, we should be giving out some more 4s. And once the teachers really looked at that and thought about it, there wasn't much pushback at all on that. That is something where we can improve and look to that. So like I'm hoping to see more of the 3.5s and 4s in the second trimester, especially around the preparedness, than we did in the first trimester. So the clear path to the 4, I guess what I'm saying is, in my family's experience, that is not happening. And it may have been communicated, but it's just, it needs to be. Yeah. So I do think that when looking at the assessments, there are kids getting 4s on, all of the assessments that are out there. In some subject areas, it may be looking at the higher level. Like when you look at math, you look at the indicator and you look at kind of where that is at the 6th grade level, and what you're naturally going to do with that child is looking at the 7th grade. What's the content level of the 7th grade for that child. In science and social studies, it may be taking whatever information, whatever it is, and analyzing it or applying it to a current event or something like that. So like the analyzing and applying are huge words that we see in that 4 level on the social studies and science. But I will say that it's something that if you had asked me that question 3 years ago or 2 years ago, were we always having a clear path to a 4 when Ben was there? I'm not sure that I would say we have it on some. We're working to get there with that, where I feel a lot better of where we are on the content list. Okay. So I feel like we think we're one place and we're not. So I'll definitely follow up with the teachers on that. That
Yeah, it's unclear to me.
Yeah.
And I think it's unclear.
Yeah. No, I can definitely follow up with the teachers on that.
Yeah. I mean, my experience too is that a lot of the discretion between the 3 and 4 is left to the teacher. So some teachers are a lot more generous giving out 3.5s and 4s than others. Some don't give any 4s. They say, if this whole year don't expect to get a 4, no one is going to get a 4. That will happen in the next grade. Whereas other teachers who may be teaching the same content may be more generous, and they may be giving 4s. So it's a problem for the kids who are looking at the other kids, and they're doing similar work or better, and they're getting a lesser grade. I don't want the structure to be so rigid that the teachers are becoming robots because they need to grade everything exactly the same way. But at the same time, there is sometimes too much discretion, and it becomes unfair.
Well, and like in math, that depth of understanding can be, in certain things, is going deeper, does bring you sometimes to new grade levels.
But in new grade levels, you're learning new content, and you're being taught new content. So how is somebody in 6th grade who's not being taught 7th grade material supposed to magically achieve 7th grade material?
No,
it's not part of the curriculum. How are we expecting students to get there? That's not clear.
Well, I think that within the, especially in the math in the 6th grade where we have that co-teach model, is you are seeing a ton of that, that clear pathway for those kids. They have a teacher sitting there with 5 of them or 8 of them, depending on what the unit is or the subject is, where they are having that opportunity to go deeper and do that.
I mean, it's tough because the idea that teachers grade differently has always been an issue, right? Whether it's an A, B, C, D, or whether it's a 1, 2, 3, 4. There's an A in this class was a B in that class, and that's always been an issue, right? So we've tried to sort of make it with the introduction, in my mind, the introduction of the rubrics tries to at least narrow that a little bit. So they're all sort of starting from the same place, but it's always there is discretion.
And that is the hope on what the scoring criteria is doing to that, what's going on in a French classroom, what's going on in a Spanish classroom. They still have the same world language, scoring criteria.
Right. And, I think the idea of the next grade level was a 4. My experience has been that was the language of a 4 back a few years.
Yeah.
Like, when my son was in 1st or 2nd grade, like to get a 4 in reading, you had to be reading a grade level, like, it's a letter for the grade ahead, right?
Yeah.
I haven't heard that as much from me about how to get a 4, but we've definitely had the issues where I saw a kid had every question right on his math test and he got a 3.
Yeah.
Well, that's not right.
Yeah, that's a math test issue.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and it might be the right grade for that kid because there were no 4-level questions on that test.
Right. And there should always be.
There should, without a doubt, there should always be.
So this time, the next test, there were additional questions which would typically require people to have a deeper depth of knowledge of the content to be able to get right and therefore get the 4. I mean, so it's tough because when there's a lot of teachers, it's a lot coming at them.
I will say though, this is the same thing I heard when we were in an ABC. What do I have to do to get an A? What do I, how do I get to an A? There's, that. So I mean, this isn't a new.
But wasn't the way I was graded up and through graduate school is that you are tested and you are assessed and you have a number associated with those assessments, and then those correlate to an A, B, C, or D. There seems to be a lot, as Lindsay is saying, a lot of discretion. And there could be discretion not just on whether or not a particular teacher thinks that they are meeting a particular proficiency, but there could be assessments or a discretion around whether or not a teacher even likes a student, or does a student have mental health issues and behavioral issues, and are they a challenge for that teacher, and therefore the teacher is grading them a little bit less. I mean, there's so many variables left up to the teacher. It makes me uncomfortable as a parent.
And that's what we hope to take out with like scoring criteria, for all the standards.
And don't you also cross-review, when you guys in their PLCs, they go, hey, this was my assessment, this is how I graded it. How would you have graded it? Like, don't they do that work? Not on every.
I mean, it would be great to have more time with Durham, but like Durham has one science teacher. We have one science teacher in the 8th grade. When they do, they definitely have common assessments and they talk and plan that way. But that is, it's not the same as 3rd grade where you have a bunch of 3rd grade teachers together.
So I have a question back to the conversation about goals.
Yeah.
So Ray, you have a slide here that says MEA for ELA and math results will go up. You don't necessarily have a number, what % they will go up. And that prompts my question, which is, how are you going to measure whether all this work and how results in higher achievement? Because that's the...
So that's ultimately the goal, to do it. So for when the teachers, as I said, when the teachers' goals are due, we will not have MEA data, but what we've talked about is hopefully that will, lead to higher MEA scores. We're in the 2nd year of the MEAs. We're hoping that, our goal is to continue to grow. The one thing about it is the difference between MEA scores, by grade level range from about, in the 70s statewide to in the low 30s statewide. And some of the tests varied from year 1 to year 2 at the state level by like 8 to 10 points. So it's not like there's a consistent mean that you can kind of judge yourself. So more, really, we want to make sure our trajectory is going the right way, and and we are continuing to increase our scores. That's what we're looking for. And the other, data point that we're talking about as teachers is the percentage of kids that are meeting the standards in classes. We need to get that percentage up as well. So hopefully the habits of work will help kids meet more standards in the class, which will then lead to increased MEA scores. So
why did you choose the MEA, not the NWA, as the data point for achievement?
I think we could have, used either on that. We could have used the NWA and looked at the kids at the achievement levels in NWA with that. But yeah, I think we could have used either.
And I think we saw that same issue. Was it Emily's presentation where they had picked the number from the MEA, and I think they had that exact issue of the test really wasn't consistent year to year. Like they changed the test.
Because we're only in year 2 and they're still developing questions and doing that. So.
This is our 3rd year.
Yeah, I know, but we only have 2 years of data. So like year 1 to year 2, some grade levels really changed a lot on the state average, as opposed to NWA is a much more consistent one where they have so much more data in there.
So you'll be looking at NWA as well.
Yeah,
The fact that it's not on the slide doesn't mean that you're not.
Within the school, we use the NWA and the Fontes and Pinnell, the reading assessment. Those are the 2 major ones we use in there because we find that data to be the quickest and the most helpful and prescriptive in return. I was just hoping it wouldn't be more confusing or not, but yeah. Alrighty.
And it's always great to see that much in the green.
Yeah, it really is. And just don't know what E-F in parentheses means on all these course next to all these course names.
So that is something, once again, we wish would not have to show up. That is our jargon for organizing the standards. And I mean, I can explain to you what it means. So WL is world language, middle school is MS, for middle school, and then it's just 1, 1-1, 1-2, the numbers. Just so that's our organization of standards, and we have it in a whole outline form that goes into there. We would much prefer it not to show up. We do not have that choice.
And is that the same for like in this where you can see each class listed in the schedule? There's like items in parentheses.
Sorry.
Check about that.
Yeah, so that's once again the scheduling, and you're going to see that the rest of your time because the high school schedule has that up here too. So that's community reading is period 1, days A through F. The kids don't know we have days A through F, but we have to have it because of the way UAs rotate and the way the 8th grade schedule rotates to get that. Then period 3, this child does not have a period 2 class listed in the schedule right there. They do something else, and then the language arts is period 4. The high school has it set up as I think 1, 2, then 3, 4 as classes because they're listed. So that's just really once again our schedule jargon. Yeah. 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 Okay.
All right.
Sorry, Jen.
No, I think you answered a lot of the questions we would have asked her too.
Yeah.
So you're the lucky one.
Yeah. Do you want this? Okay.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah.
Oh, we're not using the airplane. That's even better. Hi, everyone. Think hopefully Ray did answer some questions, but if not, I will do my best to answer them. First, just giving an update on last year's goals before we look at this year's goals. So last year we had 2 goals. The first one was really at the center of what we were focused on, which was about developing our proficiency-based practices and communicating that to all of the stakeholders by the start of this school year. as this class of 2021 is our first proficiency-based class. And how we did that in terms of our SMART goals was breaking that into kind of specific targets, because that encompasses so many different parts of the proficiency system. So the first part was thinking about our reporting system. And so after doing research of other districts and working with our middle school, we did consider other programs and decided to use PowerSchool. We felt that students and staff were familiar with that program. There were benefits to other programs that we looked at, but felt that this was the way that our staff was supporting us going for this year, knowing that there would be some bumps in the road as we went forward with PowerSchool. We also worked with the proficiency committee that was district-wide, that had parents and students and representatives from all of the schools to get input on some of our policies, our processes, and then we drafted those, presented them, and they were approved by the board. We held summer professional development workshops for teachers. That's also ongoing. As we get further and further into using PowerSchool, that's something that's continued, but we did some, the start of that over the summer of training our teachers how to use PowerSchool for proficiency reporting. We also held a summer professional development workshop that's coming up in another slide too, where really we focused most of our time on habits of work and reassessment practices. And as Ray mentioned, what was really great was we shared resources with the two middle schools, things that they had created, then shared them with our teachers. And Maddie, to your question, our rubric is for habits of work is the same as their rubric, other than they have one added domain for respect that we don't have at the high school. It had started that all of us had the same 3 domains, and then they added that, and we just haven't discussed it as a staff of whether to add that to our rubric or not. And then we worked to communicate these policies to staff, to students, and parents after they had been adopted by the board. Another piece of this was our extracurricular eligibility and academic honors. So same thing, we researched other schools before drafting our own policy, which was again presented to the board and adopted, and shared that policy with all stakeholders. That was something that, if you remember, wasn't approved until this fall. So that was shared as soon as that was approved and then put into place. We are on the quarter system, so we have already gone through 1 quarter of using this new policy, have already found some revisions that we need to make to that, but we do feel that there were some elements of that policy that worked well for our students. And then another piece of this was making sure that our scoring criteria was ready to go for all of our 9th grade courses. This is the piece that our teachers have been working on for the past 4 years. And so the scoring criteria is developed beyond the 9th grade in many of the content areas. But our primary focus was to make sure that it was ready to go for this school year. And so some people were piloting that last year, but everybody is using the scoring criteria for all 9th graders this year. And that, of course, is something that we're continuing to develop in PLCs and departments. And so what you were talking about, your question, Michelle, was about calibration. So trying to do more and more of that, of having teachers have time to look at how they would each score something that's similar. And that's something that we're trying to build more time into. And then habits of work, as I said, was another piece. This is something that has been a focus and will continue to be a focus. It is a shift for us as well to pull that out of a grade. Just as Ray said, that in many classes that was a combined grade, so it was difficult to see which portion of a grade was attributed to work habits and which was content, skills, and knowledge. And so these are practices that we continue to look into. One one of our goals last year was about visiting other schools, and we conducted 5 school visits, and we're looking at their practices, seeing what's working. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that schools like Casco Bay or Poland that have been in a proficiency-based system for a decade are still working on their habits of work practices, developing that and refining it as they go to figure out what works best for students. We held our summer workshop for our staff members, and then also for staff members who didn't attend that, we shared highlights from the summer workshop in PLCs and in faculty meetings this year. We have a draft of habits of work guidelines that has been shared with staff, and it's shared in each classroom per the teacher, because there's some room for flexibility and some practices that are school-wide. And again, that's something that we're working on continuously in PLC, and we'll continue to focus on. And then this last part for last year was about communication of our proficiency-based practices throughout the year. We are happy to report that we held our 3 parent events, and they were well attended. I think we had positive feedback from that. One in January, one in April, and then the one that was scheduled for June, unfortunately, had to be moved to August, but we found that that was pretty effective. It was a couple of days before school started, and the concerns that parents had, which as we get closer and closer to the start of school, shift of what is their worry. And so we found that that was a good time to have parents have a chance to talk to us right before school started. And then for our open house events, Sherry Williams, who's our district support for Power School, she and Charlie held kind of open invitation parent workshops. We did that last year and this year for open house when people were waiting for their appointments with teachers. Then they were able to speak to both of them for any questions that they had. So that is, and I apologize, I said 2 goals. That was our 1 goal broken into many pieces last year. And so I think that we are in this process of continually reflecting on and revising and further developing our practices for proficiency, which definitely leads into our goal for this year. I'll stop for questions for the goals from last year, and then lead into the goals for this year.
Roughly how many parents you had at the events? Because I feel like a lot of what we hear is that people don't feel necessarily like they understand it. So I'm wondering if it's that we're not getting enough of them at our events, which I know is always hard to get people to events because everybody's so busy. But do you have a sense of how many people we reached in those?
Yeah, we were impressed. We had an average of about 100 people at the first 2, and so that could be 2 parents and a student would account for 3. Some people brought their student, some people brought 1 parent, so it just depended. But typically, when we held in for the class, I believe it was the class of 2019, I want to say, when we were doing some information events, we would have 15 people there, 20 people there. And so, and then the August 28th one was, I think, well attended as we were very close to the start of school. So we were happy with the turnout. I think we can always do better, but I think that our communication and giving advance notice, I think that helped, and we will do that again this year. I've been accused for the first time of over-communicating. I'm okay with that. I don't have a YouTube video. I learned something new. So, Ben, you might get tapped to help me do that, because I've never made a YouTube video. Okay, so I'm just going to grab one note sheet. Excuse me.
Yeah, did we figure what the bang was? Did Charlie not come in?
We did not. No. Charlie disappeared. Charlie did go to investigate. He was unable to determine the source of that sound. Sounded very familiar when we were blasting. Yeah. We were blasting for the track. It sounded similar to that. So for our goals for this year, we have our first goal is really what we feel is a continuation of last year, a little bit more detailed and some slight revisions to our action steps for that goal. And then the second goal is a database goal tied to the achievement on 9th and 10th graders for the NWEA. So you have the template, I believe. And so our first goal, sorry that the font is so small. I can expand that. Our overall goal is, again, to refine and continue to develop our proficiency-based practices, because next year it will be half of our school that is in this system. And so we are feeling positive and confident about the direction that we're going, of being prepared for all of our 9th and 10th grade students to be in this proficiency system. And what we've tried to do is outline really what our focus will be to get us to this goal, to be well prepared. So the first one is expanding training on the reporting system. We want to take advantages of, now that we've decided that Power School is the program that we're going to use, we're focusing our school visits to schools who are in a proficiency-based system that are using Power School. And so that involves schools that are nearby. But I think most of you have heard me say before that I'm in a principals PLG group that meets periodically throughout the year. And we are principals from all the New England states. And so there's two schools that I work closely with, their principals that are in Vermont, and they are ahead of us in terms of timeline, and they're both using Power School. And so they've kind of weathered some of the challenges. And so we've talked about visiting those schools and getting our teachers in touch with their teachers about what's working and what challenges they've had for Power School. Whereas last year we were investigating other programs, whether we wanted to go back to Jump Rope or Mastery Connect. And so now we'll be able to focus some of our visits for schools that are using Power School. In addition to that, we have not had a teacher representative go to the Power School trainings. And so that's something that we'd like to do to the more extensive Power School trainings. We've had some that have done a more overview training. And so Charlie is going to be our admin representative, and also bring at least one teacher, if not two teachers, with us to some of the Power School trainings. And then again, reflecting on our policies, reassessment, habits of work, eligibility, to see what's working and not working. And one of the things that we're doing is soliciting feedback from anyone who's teaching 9th graders. And so our leadership team was talking about that this week, about setting that up so that teachers have a chance to give feedback on what's working and what's not working. The second part of this goal is making sure that the scoring criteria is ready to go. In many content areas, it already is ready to go. Others are making revisions to that as we've been implementing the 9th grade scoring criteria. But that will be continued work, so that, as Ray was explaining, even though there might be we still want to make sure that there's individuality in teachers' classrooms, but that there's consistency of what the standards and indicators are, that there's commonality no matter who is teaching the same section of a class. Ultimately, the summative assessments are tied to the same standards and the same performance indicators. And then there's flexibility in the way that teachers get there. And in addition to that, habits of work is also something that we'll continue to work on, so that that's ready for the class of 21 and 22. One huge advantage that we've seen from all sharing the same 3 standards on habits of work is that the current 9th graders were all familiar with that rubric. So it was a very different situation this year in terms of not having to teach them what a habits of work rubric was or what the indicators were. They already knew that. What we've worked on is, what does that look like in my particular class? One thing that I'll show you as an example, this is just what one teacher's done. I know this is hard to read, is that you'll see that this teacher has made her own rubric, and there's quite a few who have done this, where the white box right here is our school-wide rubric. The blue is, what does this look like in my class? And so teachers are working on, some have, and everybody's done this in a different way. Some teachers have involved students in this process. What do you think that a 4 would look like in this class? And so that kids are able to say, well, if I'm doing X and Y, that's a 3. If I'm doing X, Y, and Z at this level, then that would be at a level 4. We're also talking about how, what's the difference between a habits of work score that is given to a student over time? So saying over a week period, how many of the deadlines are you consistently meeting every single deadline that this teacher has set, versus a habits of work score that's tied to one particular assignment? And those are conversations that we're having regularly. And so different teachers have come up with this, and then what we are doing is, as soon as one teacher comes up with this, we're sharing this with all teachers in PLC to say, here's another example of how you might do this in your class. But it's definitely something that has varied from teacher to teacher, and as it always has. I think that probably, as we were commenting about before, everyone can probably remember from their own experience that in some classes effort was 10%, in another it was 20%, in another it was 30%. The most I've ever heard was 50%, which to me is, if 50% of a class, if I say only 50% of a class is skills and knowledge, that to me is worrisome of saying, it's a major influence on that grade of in another class where it could be 90% was skills and knowledge. And so that's a place where we're working to have some more consistency there.
And that sheet was shared with students?
Yes. Yep. So that's a rubric that students would get no matter what habits of work assignment they were working on. Mm-hmm.
So this may be a longer discussion for another time, but I'm curious about the teacher putting that together and those who are doing that and sharing that with other teachers. I think that's wonderful. I think some of the questions we had for Ray before are around, it's great that we have these communication opportunities for parents to understand scoring, etc. But most parents get their information from their one-on-one with their teacher, like the conversations that Lindsay was talking about. So I'm curious about how engaged teachers are in that, which ones are proactively creating their own rubric as it relates to their class, and which ones are really resisting it. Because to me, that's where the success of this whole thing happens with each individual teacher. So probably a deeper conversation, but that's something I'd love to know more about over time.
And I think it's something we'll continue to work on, changing mindset of, I think Michelle said before that we are asking some teachers, this is a minor shift in practice. Some teachers, this is a major shift in practice. And this is one of maybe 10 shifts we're asking them to make right now. And so I think we're always battling that no matter what. And I think just constantly providing time and support and resources of this is what it could look like. Some, when we're looking at a rubric such as the one I just showed you, some teachers do that verbally and don't have, they would say in my class, or there might be a poster in the room. So there's so many different ways that could look. We haven't said as a school, everyone needs to make their own version of this habits of work rubric. The idea was we made this rubric as a school to use it. And then in terms of the resistance question, I think that varies. But I think no matter what, we are attacking with that of saying, what support can we give you? If this is the shift we're making as a school, then what help do you need to get you there?
Kind of feeding off that, I know we've had situations where we have long-term subs that come in the middle of the year or for whatever reasons. If you've never been in this environment and never used this, how does that training go on to make sure the grading's being done properly?
I think anytime we have a situation like that, it's unfortunate. It's not what anyone would choose to have happen, and we remedy it as best we can. And so whenever we have a situation like that, first thing we do is pair that person up with the department chair. Our department chairs and our teachers are pretty outstanding at offering support and rallying. And so I think there's times where we've talked to guidance about, what's a fair situation of, are those students getting an incomplete? Are there ways that we're making sure that they're grading? We've had other teachers take on that teacher's grading. There's different ways that we've addressed that. But I think no matter what, we want to make sure that it's fair and clear to kids, that they're not penalized for a situation that we couldn't predict. Mm-hmm.
I guess the same question would be for new hires too. What sort of training do they undergo? Is it the same as what you just listed for long-term subs, where you would pair them with the department head and you'd treat it kind of the same way?
I think, what we're really lucky to do is that I think as a district team, we've committed to early hiring processes. And so most times, best case scenario, which we had, it worked out really well last year, was we had everyone hired by the springtime. And so some of our new hires were able to come in depending on their situation. Some came in at the end of last year and met with the person who was leaving. Some met with department chairs. Almost all of our new teachers came to our workshops that we offered in the summer. And then new teachers also have to come. I always feel badly, like we definitely probably overload them with information on the day that we have them here. We do really try to focus on instruction the day that we have them before school starts. And then they also come to those PLD days. For some of them, it's definitely, I would say, information overload. But really, we're being careful in our hiring of asking, what's your background with proficiency-based practices? So we have a new teacher who is, coming from her graduate program where this is all she did in her program. And so she's very familiar with proficiency-based practices. So we're trying to hire the best people that we can and people who would add perspective. Same with a teacher who's coming from another school. We've been asking, what's your experience in a proficiency-based system? So that has really helped. So some of our new teachers are bringing in information to our current staff too. So then the next part of this is the communication. And so we've shifted this a little bit from last year. We would, if you see down at the bottom, we would still like to hold, we're going to hold 2 instead of 3 parent information nights. I think we'll probably also hold that August one where, I shared with the board last year that we got feedback of in August, people want to know, how do I call in my kid sick and where do I drop them off? They were way more concerned about that than proficiency. And so that will be the focus of the August meeting. But what we'd like to do in addition is, for the last 3 years that I've been here, we've been holding principals' coffees throughout the year. They've had different themes. A lot of them have been tied to proficiency. And so what we'd like to do is, for 2 of those principals' coffees this year, is turn them into parent focus group meetings. I'm hoping that we will have good attendance from 9th grade parents. We usually do. That's usually who comes to the principal's coffees. And so then we'll also hold 2 student focus group meetings. And this is in addition to the feedback meetings that we'll do with teachers. And so we will take good notes, share those appropriately, and use that information to see from a parent perspective and a student perspective what's working or what's not working, and what support do we need to add there. So that's that for the first goal. Our second goal. So this is our goal that is our database goal tied to our NWEA scores. And there's a few different things that we want to look at when we're thinking about how we are implementing the NWEA test and how we're using the data. One thing for background information is that at the high school level, NWEA has come and gone. And so there were periods of time where we were not administering the NWEA, and then it was brought back my first year, 3 years ago. It wasn't consistent in the time frame we were giving it. We went winter to spring. The next year we went fall to spring. And this year we felt confident that with the rest of the administrative team that we've made the decision to do spring to spring testing, and then other testing throughout the year would be progress monitoring for our RTI for our students who need that. And so we're feeling like that consistency of implementing the test is really going to help to give students, staff, and parents a clear vision of why we're administering this test, how we're going to use the data, and how it's going to help us. We think that changing that mindset is definitely going to be something that's going to help us. Out of our students who tested last year, we had a total of 275 students test, and we had 44 students opt out, and 42 of the 44 were 10th graders. So 28% of the 10th grade class last year, who's our current junior class, did not take the NWEA test. And we feel like it's important to have as close as we can to get to 100% of students taking that test so that we can really see that the data accurately reflects what our students know and can do. I think that it takes us communicating better with parents, communicating better with students about this is something that we're doing. We are using the data, and we do feel like it's important for your student to take this test. And hopefully that's going to help as a shift in culture. So our goal is that all students in the 9th grade and 10th grade that meet their individual growth target in math and in ELA will be increased by 5%, and that this will be the first time that we're measuring that data from spring to spring. Fall to spring of last year in math, the percentage was 36% of our 9th graders met their individual growth target and 44% of our 10th graders. So those are two numbers that we would like to definitely improve. Our steps for that, in addition to kind of changing the mindset, another piece of this is changing some of the logistics of the testing and doing some pieces that are working well for our 2 middle schools. In terms of instruction, we have our new math curriculum in algebra with the Big Ideas, and also our geometry classes are piloting the Big Ideas program this year. We've also implemented a math support class, which was based on NWEA data from last year. So students who were underperforming have been put into that math support class. So we'll be tracking the data of those kids to see the success of that class. And we are providing coaching and professional development for the math teachers with the new curriculum. That has been coaching through our own district staff, but also with representatives from Big Ideas. And then the last one is that one of our major things that is our focus for our strategic plan and for our PLC work is formative assessment and formative feedback this year. And we're feeling like using data to inform our students about their strengths and their areas of need is definitely going to have a positive impact. And that's been something that we've been working on with all teachers in all grade levels, and are hoping to see that as an impact on the data for the 9th and 10th grade. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense why so many families or kids opted out of taking the test, the NWEAs?
I think that we could have done a better job communicating from the start of what we were going to use the data for, why we were feeling like this was important. When parents contacted me to tell me that they wanted their student to opt out, I then said, I really think it's important that your student take this test. This is going to be helpful information for us about their learning. But it was almost too late. They'd already been decided. And then it also spread like wildfire around school that you could opt out.
Yeah. Were they just feeling over-tested? Because it was 10th grade year, not junior year. So
right. And it was 10th grade spring, so there was no other test at that time.
Yeah. So it was an anomaly, you think?
It happened the year before, too. So I think that,
I'm just
again,
wondering if there's a backlash against testing, like maybe we as a district need to communicate more, like this is how we're measuring a lot of different things. Like this may be I just wanted to hear about it because what should I say if I'm talking to somebody about it?
I mean, I think that we'll continue to communicate that this is something we want to do consistently from year to year. It enables us to see progress over time. It enables us to support students who are high achieving, students who are struggling. I think it gives us good information about class placement, what's an appropriate placement for a student.
And maybe that's it too. If it was inconsistent, it just doesn't feel like a regular part of the culture. So that's a goal.
Yes.
One thing I've heard from parents that even at the lower grades that opt out, like, well, my kid's not a good test taker. I don't want him to feel like he didn't. I'm like, well, I don't even share the results with my kid. I don't know. Maybe you're supposed to. I don't. But I think the idea of making sure that this could help, right? Knowing where we have gaps with the kids helps us make decisions better.
Mm-hmm. As you say that, I think one of the things that as a administrative team, we've done a webinar that NWA has done such a much better job of their online program of what you can access. It's beautiful and color coded, and I flip my computer around and show it to teachers and they're like, wow. And I think if we showed that to parents to say there is so much information that we get on just your student from this website, that if your student doesn't, because some of the students who didn't test were also our neediest students, so that we didn't get the data on them. And so I think we would be able to say, this is the level of detail. It shows strengths for every kid. It shows areas of need for every kid. And so maybe that's something that we could communicate. I don't know how many people would come to our NWA workshop, but maybe a YouTube video would work.
So if we can just communicate that better, I think that's going to do wonders.
Yeah.
And one more thing is that we need to assuage parents' concern that we're not teaching to the test, because a lot of the resistance towards the assessing is what happens before the assessment.
Yeah.
And if we paint it as, this is just another milestone, it's like any other assessment that they get on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. We're not teaching to the test. They're getting taught what they will be taught with or without the test.
Right.
Then that would probably help. Because that's what I hear the most as well. Mm-hmm. We have the test, then they don't learn anything. They just learn how to take the test, and we should just explain that that's not what we do.
Right.
The earliest stages, they actually do have to teach them how to take the test. Right?
Yeah.
But I mean, that is different. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
So that they can do better on the test. Right?
Yeah. So our goal for ELA is very similar. 5% is what we're hoping to increase, 5% or more. Where we stand right now is that 48% of our 9th graders met their individual growth goal and 40% of our 10th graders. So we're hoping that all of these measures that we've talked about, also for ELA, we implemented the literacy support class in addition to the math support class. Those are also students who were placed in that class based on their NWA scores from last year. And so we'll be monitoring those students to see the impact of that class. And again, all of our teachers are working on the formative assessment and formative feedback so that students are getting more feedback over time, which hopefully will improve this as well.
So, Jen, when you say math support class or literacy support class, is that beyond the math lab and the writing lab?
Yeah.
And
so
the callback, this is something else?
That's in
layer?
addition. So that was the increase to the budget that I asked for last year, a 0.25 person. And so this is the class that we created. So they're very small classes. The math classes are mixed together, 9th and 10th grade, because we don't do math at the high school by level, by subject, algebra or geometry. And then the literacy class, there is a 9th grade section and a 10th grade section. So students take it. It's a 40-minute class every other day, and it's in addition to their math class or their ELA class. So they have 40 extra minutes, plus they also, some of them have been assigned to the math lab in addition to that, and then they also have callbacks during advisory.
I was wondering if the increase by 5%, is that for each grade, or are you combining 9 and 10?
No, for each grade.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then
5 percentage points. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the 48, you want to increase that, and you want
to 53%.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. And my other question was just sort of, not that you want to have too many goals, but it sounds like a goal needs to be to increase the number of participants in the on the test.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Just thought maybe.
I think we inherently want to do that.
Okay.
So
you don't
and we have good numbers we have very good numbers for SAT, but that's required by the state, and students know that. And so I think some of the techniques that we use to make sure students are here for the SAT, that we can use that for NWA as well. Yes. Ben, you can tell everyone it's required. Ben said.
Now, I have questions about the PBE implementation, and I just want to be upfront with both Ray and Jen, that I see huge progress from when they started to up until now. Obviously, there's still a lot of loose ends to tie up, and we do hear in the neighborhood and the community and parents who write to us that there is still a lot of work to do. So the things that we mentioned for Ray and the middle school apply to the high school.
Sure.
So the discrepancy in how teachers interpret, and just the inflation and deflation of grades, where kids get lumped into grades with wide ranges, all these things basically apply to both schools. At the high school level, there's an additional concern that the 9th graders are actually receiving grades that are developed through the how that is still in flux, and the content grades that are still in flux, and the scoring criteria that is still in flux, and those grades will actually be reflected in their transcripts when they apply to college. So there are a lot of parents who have grave concern about the fact that we're grading kids while we develop the system, and how is that going to affect these kids when they actually need to present the transcript to college. And there's discrepancy on so many levels that I personally wonder whether it wouldn't be better just to delay the use of the 1 to 4 and not use it for any transcript or to generate any transcript in the future until we work out some of the kinks. Because I think it's unfair to have something that is evolving, and as it evolves, we're reporting on a transcript, and what happened in 9th grade may be different from what happens in 12th grade, but it's all in one transcript. And how are those kids going to explain to admissions in college that, well, you know, the first grade in 9th, how meant this, and there wasn't really a path to a 4, but then by 11th grade, they were able to figure it out, and then by then, this is more reflective of what I could do. It's no, they won't. I mean, this is a rhetorical question. No one has that level of contact with admissions to be able to explain all that. So just putting it out there as something to consider, because I have concerns, and I have to say, I consider myself lucky that our son is in 10th grade. So he has a 1 to 100, and everybody knows what that means. And by the time our next son comes around, he's in 6th grade now, so it'll all be figured out. But I really pity the parents of 9th graders and the 9th graders themselves, who may have lots of questions that are unanswered, and we're making every effort possible, but it's a huge endeavor, and every district is trying their best, and still it takes a long time to figure this out. And just looking at districts around us, now it dawns on me why so many of them, Yarmouth, Brunswick, Cape, Falmouth, decided to delay the 1 to 4 grading and to start with the standards, keep the grading system as is, develop the standards, make it all work, and then once all the rubrics and all the different pathways are figured out, then you make the next step, which is to actually change the grading. I don't know how there feels about this, but I was a firm believer that no, we want the pure system, because this is how you write the rubric, and the 4 means something and the 3 means something. But I'm realizing now the 4 means a lot of different things. The 3 means a lot of different things. And not only that, we don't understand how colleges interpret what a 3 or a 4 means, let alone what it means to us. So I'm sorry to put it all out on the table, but I feel like it's my responsibility because I'm hearing this over and over. And I just don't want parents to lose faith in PBE and standards, which are wonderful, and provide clarity and opportunities for kids to learn deeply and all the great things we want to teach them to do. But it's hard to sell it when on the surface all these little things bother people on such a deep level.
There's a lot to comment on. I mean, we are operating on board-approved policy, which I think that's the system that we've been working on for 4 years, and that's the system that we're on. And I think that no matter what with colleges, you know, I come from a school where a 60 was a D-. Now, this is a school where a 70 is a D-. So for all of our students at this school who fail with a 69, 68, 67, in my previous district where I was for a decade, that was a D+. And those kids are applying to the same colleges that we are. They're getting the same credits. I think there's grade discrepancy in every district of what it actually means. My former district had a policy that effort participation could not be more than 20% of a grade. So we knew that 80% of a student's grade was content, skills, and knowledge, which we have adopted here at this high school as well, but only for the past 2 years. So prior to that, it could be that discrepancy of what I was talking about, that a student who had a 95 in a class, that could be because they worked really, really hard and still don't understand the content. And so I think no matter what, there is discrepancy in grading. Unless you're a school system that has a lockstep system where you say, this is the percentage, this is how you grade, and then still that teacher sits with a pile of essays and still has to grade that and decide what goes into it. So I think no matter what system we choose, I don't think that a college would think that an 85 means the same thing for every school, because I think it can mean a huge difference in different schools. And I would say that it's similar to the 1 to 4 system. I think no matter what, there's different discrepancies. I think the argument can be made that it tells a much clearer picture of what a student knows and can do. I definitely hear the nuance between how many kids are identified at certain levels, We had our highest number of ninth graders on honor roll this year that we've had in at least the last 3 years. We did not hear parent complaints about that, by the way. But so I think that's and that was based on habits of work. That was not based on academic scores. Academic scores will be for the honor roll. That's at the middle point of the year. So I think no matter what, we're going to have discrepancy in the system, and we would with the 0 to 100 too. I agree that we need to hear feedback from everyone and figure out how to be more consistent about grading. I don't think that we have ever had a conversation at the high school about a 4 not being an option. That's not something that we've talked about a lot. I think there's places where people are trying to figure out what the 4 looks like, but that hasn't been a conversation for a summative exam that a 4 wouldn't be on it. What we're wrestling with is 4s for habits of work and how you come to that. But I also think in the first quarter, teachers were already talking about, okay, so this is what a 4 would look like. And some of those things that we used to enter in a grade book, like you got an A if you covered your textbook, they don't go into the grade book anymore. They're just not there. It's just a class expectation. I'm telling you to do it, so you should cover your textbook. And so I think those are things that have to change in the system.
No, I'm not saying that there any grading system that is perfect. I mean, we know by personal experience that it's not the case. It's just that when I look at the goal, I see a lot of will be developed, will be revised, will pilot, will be implemented, reflected, and further refined. So there's a lot here that is in flux and that it's ongoing. And I know that the traditional systems are perfect. They're also open to interpretation and subjectivity, but those are systems that people know and that give them confidence. Mm-hmm. And what I'm hearing a lot is, this is a new system, I do not understand it, it changes every day, what do we need to implement it now? So it's one thing to say, we'll never do it, I'm not saying that, I'm saying, isn't it premature to do it now? Because as much as this is about education, this is about publicity and PR and bringing people along and inspiring people to, join along and support it. And I just don't see that happening because the 1 to 4 is getting in the way. And I'm starting to have concerns that it's the 1 to 4 that will make it more difficult to be successful in implementing the standard space, which is what we really want. Nobody really cares if it's 1 to 4 or 1 to 100 or A to Z or whatever. I mean, what's really important is how we teach, and how we grade may be counterproductive. That's what I'm saying.
I agree with that fully, in the fact that there are a lot of things that need to be worked out, and there's a lot of ground that needs to be covered that we should be making the time for, possibly outside of implementation. But there have already been a couple times, and I was one of the students where this happened, for 3 years in a row. We said, or what I've heard anyway, is that we're trying to do standards, and then by half the year there was so much pushback on it that we ended up delaying it more and more. And I think at this point we've already made it far enough so that if we stop now, then you're just not going to see the same kind of progress on a short time scale that you would if it was off the table and out of school systems. I think that in looking at the big picture, putting the effort in now to allow students to figure out what's wrong with it and make the necessary changes while they're working with the system is going to be very beneficial down the road once we figure out that we made a right decision and now it's working smoothly. And I think that's the best way to do it, is just working through it.
So we did that, and we sort of backed off of it. And it's hard because there are kids We can't be like, well, let's think about for next year. No, we need to be able to make changes fast to the system, you know, not premature, but like if you're seeing consistently, oh gosh, that is not working. Like, you know, rounding down from a 2.25 to a 2, that's not right. That's not right for the kids. That's not, you know, reflective of their performance. How can we fix that now? And if we can't be nimble, then maybe we do have to say, we can't implement this at live. But if we can be nimble and can make changes as, you know, the needs arise, then I think, you know, we're best served to keep it moving. And I think a huge piece of it is the communication, right? You know, the things we heard are, you know, habits of work don't count. Well, we know that's not true, but obviously some parents and kids don't know that's not true. So what can we do to build the confidence to make sure that people know, hey, this is how you use Power School. Like, you know, you said you had at open houses, they could do that. Like, I was thinking at the middle schools, what a great idea to have like a Power School night where they could come in and, you know, just literally watch them go down through and learn, like, I didn't know that's what that meant, you know? So I think a lot of it is, I feel like candy, it's communication. And, you know, but I certainly understand the concern for those 9th graders. Like, we can't just let them be guinea pigs and fly in the wind. Like, sorry guys, you didn't get into Harvard because we didn't have our stuff together. You know, we don't want to be responsible for that. And it's a real concern for those parents, which means it's a real concern for us. So, I mean, it's tough. I've struggled with this one for a while.
Those are all really good points. I do agree that it's not live. It's hard to keep evolving at the pace we need to. But I am really, really concerned that this, like, the grade inflation thing or disinflation, I don't know which term you want to use, but former A students are getting 3s. And for those students who do want to apply to Harvard and like top schools, they need to look like 4 students. And I keep hearing the affirmation that colleges have, you know, they see these different systems, they know that each school is different, and blah, blah. But the simple fact that it's a 3 out of a 4 means that it's not excellence. You know, like the superficial, a 3 out of a 4, that just reads in fractions 75%. You know, and so the basic math of it on a superficial level just completely makes top students look like not top students. And that is going to cause parents to leave the district because it's their children's future. I mean, this is what they, you know, where they want to go, and it's going to be too confusing for them to tolerate. So
It's miscalibration, right? So they shouldn't be at 3. So how can we fix that?
Well, I've been asking for equal opportunities to earn 4s for 3 years, and we haven't been able to achieve it. So how long I mean, we can't just keep asking.
But you're talking about the middle school level, right? That where you've asked for that.
Yeah.
At
I would expect that it should be available. I mean, it shouldn't be like a massive change from what's available in middle school, like the system, what's expected.
Right.
How do you earn a 4? All this stuff. It should be consistent in some degree.
That's part of the goal, right? Is that it's
And I think one thing just to remember, and it's not that I don't agree with hearing the concerns and things like that, but I think one thing to remember is that this school has always been on a 4.0 scale for a GPA. And so that is a number. And so students right now still earn a GPA. It's the average. And that was something I shared with the board in the fall, in September, that kind of flies in the face of proficiency. But we were doing that because we felt like students and parents still wanted to see a GPA. So their standard scores on the 4.0 scale are all averaging to turn out to be a GPA. And so that is something that colleges have been familiar with forever.
Can you tell me with absolute confidence that for every opportunity to earn a 3, there's an opportunity to earn a 4, and the teaching is consistent with providing
mean, I don't think I don't want to speak for every teacher. I would say that we're trying to
have that confidence that that's available, and that's what I'm saying.
Yep.
Is that parents don't have that confidence right now. We're freaked out, and we can't have a class of students live through that. It's not fair.
And what's going to happen to that class of students if we continue the way we are now? I mean, we are making progress. I want to make sure that you understand that I feel that way. I don't think we're making enough progress quickly enough. And it's not for any lack of trying of administrators. It's that students and teachers, they're all human beings. Parents are human beings. Change is difficult. It takes a long time. And going to what Lindsay was saying is, if we continue the way we're going now, or advance at the pace we're advancing now, I can imagine that the current 9th graders, when they get to 12th grade, there will be a whole bunch of them who have earned 3.5s, and those are your high achievers. These are all kids who need to distinguish themselves. They're not able to if they're all at a 3.5. How do you say, well, I'm a little more advanced, or I can think a little more deeply or more critically than the other person who's competing for the same spot to this high caliber college that I really, really want to get into, and that's what I've been studying for 14 years to do. So I just don't want to be the one telling parents, no, just sit back and relax, keep waiting, be patient. It's not going to affect your kids' grade, because I just don't believe it won't affect their grades. And I've been asking them to be patient for 4 years. And I don't have it in me to keep saying, it's working, be patient, relax, it's all going to turn out okay. I don't know, I'm just such a downer, but I just need to be honest.
Just for the sake of playing devil's advocate for a moment, I just, in the college application process, they look at so much more than grades and GPAs. And I really think that one of the fundamental issues and why we have such a problem with parent population is that that wasn't the case for us. It's changed drastically. They look at essays, they look at life experiences, they look at a kid's ability to articulate having overcome some kind of a personal challenge, they look at leadership opportunity, they look at extracurriculars. So, I mean, I don't disagree that this needs our attention, but I think I just would like to see us be more nuanced and appreciative of the full range of opportunity that a kid has when they apply to college, because college after college visit, that's what they told us, and that was certainly borne out in our experience of my son applying to schools.
I think the other just like kind of one fact is that at the high school we are going to the 0.25 level for the averaging of scores, because our honor roll is 3.25 and 3.75. So we aren't going at the, so you have to, yes. So the reason why we don't score on a 3.1 or a 3.2 is because there is no way to do that transparently on a rubric. If you have a rubric that's on a 0.4 scale and you have a middle score of a 0.5, you can average it to the 0.25 level. But I would not be able to say to a student, well, this is what you have to do for a 3.1 or 3.2. And when you average those scores, that's a different story. And so that's why we have felt like, you know, we had similar numbers for honor roll, and now again that was based on habits of work, so we'll know at the end of the year what that looks like. But we had similar numbers this year for honor roll that we did last year for honor roll for kids who were for high honor roll, who were 3.75 and above. So I do think, I think another place to add on what Maddie is saying is they're looking at the classes that you're taking, because if you took the lightest possible load and got a 95 in every class that you took, colleges are hyper aware of that, of what they look at, what we offer, what you took, and what are the grades. So if there's a student who has a 3.75 in our senior seminar elective, which is very helpful, but it's not the same as AP biology. That's what a college is definitely highly aware of, what makes a student stand out. And college is on a 4-point scale.
So, communication again.
Yeah.
How do we communicate all this to parents? And
apparently
including
YouTube.
the fact, yeah, well, YouTube is one for a start. But there are some other things that we need to do a little more research before you communicate it with parents.
Yeah.
The merit-based scholarship. I had a couple of parents come to me saying, you can't have access to the same amount of money if you don't have the traditional 0 to 100 scale.
Yeah.
I don't know how you figured that one out. That's just, I don't need an answer. I just want to point it out. And I also wanted to ask, in a rubric, couldn't you have a range? So when you had the 4 up there, there were a range of abilities that were a 4, and it was the same for a 3. So couldn't you say that, okay, this column isn't a straight 4. This column is 3.75 to 4, and this column is, or 3.5 to a 4, or whatever it is, so that you can have a little more nuance in the grading.
You could.
Because it doesn't necessarily have to be 1, 2, 3, 4. We could have ranges, and then within that column and within that, what now is a 4, a teacher has discretion to go to anywhere from 3.5 to a 4.
Yes, I think it gets more and more difficult of what's the evidence to justify that score. Because if I'm a student, I want to know what's the difference between a 3.1 and a 3.2. Why didn't I get a 3.2 if there's a 3.1? I think no matter what. And that's where you get into taking 1 point off for this and taking 1 point off for that, which is very different than the basis of standards. Something like this is what some of our teachers are working on, where you can see what they've done. It's similar to Habits of Work. This is a math class, a 9th grade math class, where this teacher is working to define what a 3 looks like and what a 4 looks like, and this was on a summative assessment. And so, more and more, and what I definitely hear you is the pace at which we're doing this definitely is something that we're working on. But I think the more that we're doing this, then you're able to see clearly what's a 4. And the preponderance of evidence is if you have a little bit of meets and you have a little bit of exceeds, then you're at the 3.5, and you're able to say, well, you're not quite totally in the land of 4, but you're halfway in the middle. And I think the more that we can do that is pretty clear to students. They can understand that, to say, well, there's 3 bullet points on each side. I had 2 in one and 1 on the other. That's what makes me fall in the middle. But once you got to 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, that would be really hard to understand when you're looking at a rubric like that.
Jen, would you talk about how much feedback you've had from the 9th grade class? Because I think that is where you have, that's the first class going to that. And I think that's where you've spent a lot of effort in doing that communication.
Mm-hmm.
How many parents have kind of reached out to you? I mean, we had one tonight, I know.
We have one tonight, but not a high school. He's not a high school parent, is he? Not yet. So I've only had one who is significantly concerned about Power School, and it was more about being able to see. I do think those slashes of things that are not yet graded are really confusing people. I think that would be like in a traditional system if someone put in every assignment that they were going to do for the whole year and hasn't been graded yet. And so we have not heard, Charlie nor I have had a slew of parents coming to us and saying we are significantly concerned. I think that there was one parent that I was going back and forth on about Power School and how often grades were getting put in. But beyond that, I do think that parents are asking teachers some questions, but they're not coming to the level of, my assumption would be if they're asking a teacher a question and they're not getting the response that they want, usually that's when they come to me or to Charlie. And that has not happened this year with our 9th grade parents. And so, and I do also, I keep every parent email that is sent to me, and so there are lots of things that parents are emailing me about. So I feel confident that Charlie and I are both, we try to answer all emails in 24 to 48 hours, and I think that parents are giving us lots of positive feedback about how often we're sharing information, and so we aren't hearing them really panicked and worried. Now again, these aren't students who are applying to college right now. They're just in 1/4 of the way through their freshman year, and so I am hoping that those parent information sessions and the kind of continual updates that we send are going to help.
So it could be that we're doing a good job of educating the people that it's impacting at that 9th grade level, but the fear is that, like, particularly at the middle school level, if they're just sort of out there floating in the wind with a lot of misinformation and just don't know all these other things, we could lose them between now and when you give them all the awesome information in 9th grade. And that's the risk, right? We don't want to lose them. We want to build the confidence, that our elementary school kids or teachers and admin are doing a great job. They're bringing them up to the middle school level, and they're, getting really immersed in that process of standards. And, we need those parents on board, because that's what we're hearing. I feel like most of the parents I've heard from have been at that middle school level. And there's a lot of change that happens at the middle school level, just from how we grade to how they do classes. And so when we have this sort of big potential abyss of, I don't know what happens at standards in high school, like, you could see how that could cause anxiety, right? So how do we get them up to speed?
I mean, a simple solution, we have a huge FPAC. We could invite 6th and 7th grade parents to come to there's no reason why they couldn't come to the 8th grade meetings that we have this year, and we could do a better job of advertising that. I think one thing that I want to just say about one more point in looking at neighboring districts, I think Charlie and I are trying to go to as many meetings, and we're part of the League of Innovative Schools and talking to schools all over. I think there is equal concern about turning what a lot of districts are doing is scoring things on 1, 2, 3, 4, and then converting it to a 0 to 100 grade. And there are, from what I'm hearing from other principals, there are as many, if not more, concerns with that, because they're like, wait a minute, in the school next to us, in the district next to us, a 3.5 equals an 83. Why doesn't 3.5 equal an 82 in our district? And so, the way I heard somebody explain it was, it's the 3, 1, 2, 3, 4 to then converting it is not apples and oranges. It's like apples and cucumbers. And so what I think we've looked at all different grading scales, and it's incredibly difficult to choose one that you think really reflects what a 3.75 is in terms of a number, because they are not the same system. They're not based on the same philosophy of grading. And so I think if we had chosen to go in that direction, I think there would be a ton of concerns, at least of what I'm hearing from other principals.
Yeah, and I understand that. I never would be an advocate for using conversion systems from one grading system to the other. What I was referring to was maybe having a rubric that instead of 1.1, 2, 3, 4 has 0 to 100 on the rubric, and you have ranges. So, okay, 85 to 100, these are the things you need to do, and so on until you go back to where you want to go. But by no means am I suggesting that we go to the 1 to 100 and then convert to 1 to 4 or ABC or backwards or any of those machinations. I know they don't work.
I think if you had a range on a rubric and then you tried to average that, that's what would get incredibly complicated. So if one of those blocks where it said exceeds then said 90 to 100, well, what number do you use? 91, 92, 93. So that's what can be, because that is actually, when I did my teacher training, that's what a rubric looked like. 22, if I had a 25-point quiz, 20 to 25 was an A, and 15, and I was like, wait a minute, that actually mathematically did not work out. And so I think there's danger in that too, in having a range. If you did a rubric like this, you'd have to actually pick a number if you wanted it to accurately reflect the work that a student did. Each one of those categories would have to be one number, because then you could get into even more teacher discrepancy, where in my room, if that exceeds range is 90 to 100, well, I'm picking 90 and you're picking 100. I think there would be could be a ton of discrepancy in that too.
No, I understand. I see discrepancy in all the systems.
Yeah.
However, at the very least, if one kid has a 3.5, and that's an average of 3.3 or whatever it is, couldn't we just call it 3.3 when we report it out rather than call it 3.5?
And so that's why we have chosen to go to that 0.25 level, because I think when we're averaging, then that felt like a more accurate. I mean, is that something that we talked to, that the GPA would go to that level? That's certainly something that we could do. In terms of reporting out on a regular basis, I think it would be, again, hard to tell a student, where did we come up with that number?
Mm-hmm. And why do we need to limit ourselves to a 3.25 or 3.5? Aren't there any cases where you can have something in between, like a 3.3?
No.
No. Okay.
One more quick one.
This is not about discussion. I want to thank you for the discussion. This is really helpful, and I think we can ask community members to watch this discussion because there's so much education here. But I just don't want to lose the point you made. I haven't seen the data, but anecdotally, I think that we have retention problems in 8th and 9th grade. I think that's when families make decisions about whether or not they want their kids to continue. So I love the idea of bringing in our early middle school kids to understand how this all works at the high school level. I think it's a real opportunity.
Okay. Thank you, Jen. Okay, so we've got some decisions to make here.
Yes, I move to adjourn. Oh. Yes, it is.
To do anything
10:15.
we need a vote to continue, or what's the anything that we have to vote on? Policies, we do both. We haven't voted yet this year,
No, you're right.
Yeah, we got staff conduct. I don't think I
Yeah. I was all revved up for it. In front.
Okay, so stuff we have left. So the superintendent report about the high school project and the track and field. We can try to have Becky sort of address some of those questions in our board update that she provides to us. And then if we feel like we want to add it to our next superintendent's report, we can. The MSBA resolution support for public education. Those are in your packets. Do we need a vote by a certain date on that? Do you know?
Yes, that's why I put it in here for December 21st. All this is doing is asking the board to support these resolutions by the Maine School Board Association, right? MSBA, and also the Maine School Superintendents. That's just in support of public education is what this is really about. But so it could be quick. If it's not going to be quick, we could just not weigh in RSU 5.
So I read it. I move that we just vote.
So if folks have read this, and I would entertain a motion. Well, no, we can't do anything unless we vote to do it at this point, because it's after 10. We can't do anything new without a vote to continue after 10.
Right.
So the first thing we need, if, you know.
What else needs to be done?
Well, we have an executive session.
Right.
Oh, my goodness.
So I have some thoughts on the executive session piece, and I can tell you my thoughts on that before we go into executive session. This is about negotiations. We haven't met with the union yet. That got bumped because of the weather. We haven't met as a committee yet.
Except for the
oh, right, you guys did. Support staff has already met, right?
We're on it.
Okay. So.
Well, and don't we want to have board input before our first negotiation? I think we kind of have to do that.
I agree.
Yeah,
I was like, how am I supposed to go into this? I haven't talked to anybody.
Okay.
You know?
So our first one is really just like ground rules and setting dates. It's not really
so
providing proposals or anything like that. That would happen after our next board meeting. So we could, in fact, have that discussion prior to the first negotiation.
But the ESP is one step ahead of you.
Right. So all right. So we need a motion to continue after 10.
Well, another option.
Yeah.
Special meeting next Wednesday, because there's a lot here that we need to still address.
I can't next Wednesday. Okay. So policy we can bump, right?
Yes.
Thank you. So we have the resolutions and we have the discussion on the ESP negotiations, and we could move the professional staff negotiations to our next meeting in January, because that would be prior to our first negotiation meeting. Is everybody comfortable with that? Okay, so we have a motion to, you don't have to. So we have a motion, we have a second. All those in favor for continuing after 10?
Well, we've already
Till
continued.
No, to start something new. We can't, we can stay after 10 if we're continuing. So yes, votes, 1. No votes? Okay, so that carries, thank you. So the MSBA resolution was in your packets. So the support of public education. So I would take a motion to approve that. Maddie, second. Valley, any discussion on this?
Yes, discussion.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm going to make it longer, but I have a question. First one, I'm totally fine with. The second resolution, frankly, I don't think these are rigorous enough.
You don't think, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
These pathways described on the last page.
Okay, so let me clarify.
Would this mean
Can I
that
clarify?
to graduate? Well, let me ask the question.
No, but this will clarify quickly, Valley. You need to take a big X and mark through the last page. And, right? So what you're voting on, so the way they sent it out to us, I was confused too. And so I called and said, how does that last page feed into support for public education? And he said he shouldn't have attached that one. That has already, it's nothing. You need to ignore that. And all you're looking at is 1.3, which is from the board, and then the next 1-2 pages. So anything where it starts, Valley, with support for new multiple measure college, and in that back page has nothing to do with this.
Okay, so the back 3 pages are
Okay,
all.
so I did not mean to cut you off,
I'm
but
glad
I
you
thought that
did.
would clarify.
All right. So we're back to you approved the first one. Yeah. Kate, did you have a comment?
Yep. I'm going to vote against both of these because I feel after researching what both of these groups are in support of, I feel, trying to limit educational pathways for students by opposing charter schools in particular.
Okay.
That's fair.
Any other comments, questions? All right, so ready for a vote. So we have a motion and a second. So what is the actual motion?
So the first one would be for 1.3.
Oh, so there's actual 2 votes?
Yep.
Oh, for some reason I thought they were all 1. Okay. So the motion was for the support of public education, the MSBA resolution. So this is the Maine School Boards Association resolution. Okay, so.
And that includes first.
Just the first page.
Just this
the first,
paragraph.
Just that little, which at the heart of that is just to assure the traditional public schools remain the schools of choice.
So traditional public schools, what's the definition of that?
Not charter schools. Okay, so we have a motion and a second to support, to to vote. Yeah, but we're voting to support it, right? So if you
Yes.
like it, you vote yes. If you don't like it, you vote no.
Correct.
Consideration and approval to adopt. Right, okay. So that's the motion and the second. All those in favor? Opposed?
I don't know how I feel about it. What
Right.
do I do?
Are you abstaining?
Can I abstain? Is that legal?
You don't have to vote.
Now you're under arrest.
All right, so we had what, 8, 2, and 1. Is there a rule about abstaining? Check your Robert's rules when you get home tonight. All right.
No, I think they can abstain.
Okay, so now we have the MSSA resolution, consideration and approval of the resolution to support public education. So this is the superintendent's association.
Yes, and this is really promoting equity for all, regardless of their zip code, adequate funding for public education that leads to universal proficiency. And, really it comes down to investment in public education matters.
Okay, so do we have a motion? Jen, second from Maddie. Any discussion or questions on this one?
Yeah, these are all very vague. So I'm happy to vote for this. I am supportive of what it says, but when it gets translated into policy or some kind of, lobby, yeah, or law that they write, does it accurately reflect all this? Because we don't get to see those. So if we approve this, are we saying we support anything you write from here on out that supports education? There are very many ways of supporting education.
I think this came because I think that superintendents and board feels they feel that in the last few years that public education has just taken a hit. I don't know of any. They're trying to promote the good stories about public education.
Yep.
In the research that both of these associations, when I went to their websites and looked up their resolutions, while some of this is in there, it does specifically call out charter schools, and that's why I am voting against them.
Yep. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Opposed? Abstain? You voted on that one, right?
I voted on that
Okay. All right. Good. So we mark that one off. Policy, we're going to move. So we, consideration and approval to enter into executive session pursuant to 1 MRSA Section 4056D for the discussion relating to educator and support staff negotiations for RSU 5.
Should it be educator and support staff, or are we just doing support staff?
We're just going to do support staff. Relating to support staff negotiations for RSU number 5. Thank you. Naomi, Lindsay, second. All those in favor? None opposed?
I'm opposed. You're opposed?
Oh, you're opposed to going into executive session. Okay.
Kate's opposed. Okay.
She's contrary tonight.
I don't blame her.
All right. 10:25.
Can you tell me who seconded that one? I missed it. Who seconded that one? I missed it. Who seconded that one? I missed it. Who seconded that one? I missed it.